I had just gotten out of an 8-year abusive relationship and met someone on a popular online dating app. To be honest, I wasn't particularly looking for anything serious, just someone to go and watch a movie or have a drink with every now and then. I had 2 boys and was happy and living a peaceful life on my own after going through all that hell. I meet this guy who's just a couple years older than me. He had turned his life around apparently. When he was younger, he used to be in gangs and drugs, and now he was all into working out and staying real fit, doing lots of family stuff as well. I guess you could say I kind of felt protected by him. He was a hard worker, very self-sufficient, and had a son too. He really loved going to the gym every day. I myself had kind of a crazy past, but also overcame it, so I thought we might seem like a good fit. We would go to dinner, movies, normal dating stuff. Eventually, he wanted to spend more and more time together. Well, I was having trouble giving up all my free time for him, and he would get really angry about this, like extremely angry. After being with a controlling, possessive asshole for so long prior, this was obviously a red flag. After about 3 months, I told him I did not want to see him anymore. When I told him this, he said he needed to confess something to me. He admitted to me that he was using steroids, and that was the reason for his bizarre mood swings. He cried and said he was sure that was the reason. He was willing to stop if it meant he could have another chance. I obliged, but only under the condition that we remain just friends. Things were okay for a while after. We saw each other maybe every other week or so. Once again, he started wanting to see me every week though. I told him I was not interested in being anything other than friends at the moment. I was really not ready for another committed relationship. He tried really hard to talk me into giving him another chance, but I just couldn't find myself interested in him in a romantic way. I insisted we just remain friends. I stopped talking to him altogether. I got mad at his insistence that we talk every single day. That's what friends do, apparently. He started to always question my whereabouts and ask for pictures of who I was hanging out with. I told him very sternly that's not what friends do. Every single time he would just innocently insist that he wanted to see what I was up to. Fast forward 6 months later, I hadn't spoken to him at all during this time. I was just happy and living my best life. On one particular night when my youngest son was at his dad's, I went out to a local bar with friends. My oldest son, who was 13 at the time, was home alone, so I left a little bit early to make it home around 10 p.m. I laid down in bed and went to sleep pretty much right away. Now, a little bit of info on my living situation. I had been living in my condo for almost a year now. We lived in a great, safe community. I would leave my sliding glass patio door open with the screen door closed. This was to get a good breeze in at night. I didn't really think it was a big deal. My bedroom was really close to the patio. My son would sleep in the loft that was closest to the front door. I was dead asleep when I suddenly felt someone slowly sit down on my bed. I was laying there, wondering why my son would come sit down on my bed so slowly, like he was trying not to wake me up. I realized he would not. I turned around, and it was not my son. It was Mario, not his real name, by the way, laying down in bed next to me. I sat up and asked him immediately how he'd managed to get in. He would not answer me. Instead, he said, "I needed to talk to you." Okay, well, when you need to talk to someone, don't just sneak into their room while they're sleeping. You call them or leave a note or something, literally anything but this. I was thinking to myself that I was going to kill my kid for letting him into the house. Well, I didn't have your number anymore, and I needed to talk to you before it's too late. I didn't even entertain the before it's too late bit. I was livid, but something told me to keep my cool in this moment. I sat up in bed. Look, I really want to talk to you too, but not like this. Please, just leave and I promise we'll talk tomorrow. Call me tomorrow, okay? He got up and walked over to my side of the bed. He started rubbing my shoulders and was slowly making his way to my neck. He whispered into my ear, "Do you really want to talk?" I looked him in the eyes. "Yes, I've been wanting to talk to you, but not like this. Please, tomorrow, okay?" He began to rub my neck, then went back down to my shoulders and let go suddenly. "Okay." The motherfucker proceeded to exit through my patio door and jump my patio wall. This told me exactly how he'd gotten in. I freaked the fuck out, of course. I checked on my kid and he had no idea what was going on. Locked all my doors and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I texted him and told him if I ever saw him near me or in my complex again, I would call the police. Don't ever contact me again. If you're wondering why I didn't call the cops to begin with, I knew he had a gun, so A, I was scared of being retaliated against for being a snitch. And B, I figured if I called the cops, they would probably not do much or just let him out, and I was afraid of what he would do after that. Either way, surprisingly enough, he did leave me alone, and I didn't hear from him again for years. 4 years later, though, I'm going through Facebook when I see his face in the People You May Know section. I click on the picture and notice it looked a lot like a jail picture. You know, those pictures where the person is clearly in a jail cell? I scrolled down the page. His most recent post was him posting his address for his family members to write to, a prison address. So, I Google his name. Sure enough, the first thing that pops up are articles after articles with the exact same headline. Man arrested on suspicion of killing girlfriend. About 2 years after him and I dated, he shot and killed the next girl he was dating. That very easily could have been me. I felt like shit after, thinking if there was anything I could have done to stop this. Even scarier, though, is that he only got 12 years for her murder in the end. About 5 years ago, I was living at home with my parents and my twin brother was there too. Every morning at around 7 a.m., we would both head out for a daily run. We had mapped out this giant loop that we would run. To make it a bit of a competition, I would run it in one direction, and my twin would run it in the other direction. That way, we could both run and stay focused. Part of this loop was on the main street of the city my parents live in. On this main road, there were these shady apartments, kind of hidden away by a bunch of trees. The direction I was running, the view of these apartments was obscured by a giant hedge bush. I couldn't see the apartments until I was basically right in front of them. As I started my run, out of my peripheral vision, I could see a woman standing among the trees staring at me. Immediately, I got chills and didn't turn to face her. Something about the way her body was unnerved me, and also I didn't want to be rude. I ran on and mostly forgot about this until a few minutes later. I passed my twin about 10 minutes later. He was going the opposite direction as I. Well, I get home and my twin hasn't come back yet. I go about the rest of my morning routine, including taking a shower. I hop out and my twin has still not arrived back home yet. I was starting to get a bit worried now. An hour after I had gotten home, he was still not back. I called him to check on what was happening. He told me he was on his way back now, and he had something he needed to tell me and my parents. When he finally got home, he told us that as he was running in front of these apartments, he could see a woman hanging from the trees in front of this area. As soon as it was obvious he had seen her body, a man came sprinting out of the apartments wailing and screaming, "No, I can't believe she did this!" He grabbed her body and laid her on the ground and started performing CPR. It was very obvious the man was her husband. My brother, of course, called the local police. They dispatched an ambulance and police officers as well. My brother had to stay for questioning and give a witness report and all that jazz. Obviously, he was very troubled of the sight of the woman hanging there. Since he was going the opposite way I was going, he didn't have that big hedge obscuring his view and got a straight view of this woman hanging in that tree. It's hard for me to believe that the woman I saw staring at me out of my peripherals was in fact dead the entire time. I did find it a bit sketchy as well. how coincidental it was that the husband came running out the instant it was obvious someone had discovered her body. It's a bit too convenient if you ask me, but then again, I don't want to definitively say the man killed his wife without any evidence or anything. I imagine it would be ridiculously hard to hang somebody unwillingly from a tree, so I don't really know what to say. My brother never really followed up with the police, leading me to believe the death was ruled a suicide. Still though, I just can't fathom that if I would have simply turned around to face this woman, I would have discovered she was dead 20 minutes earlier than my twin had. It deeply troubles me that I didn't. When I was 15 years old, I had the aspirations of becoming a model. I was 4'10", Asian, and had crooked teeth as well. So looking back, I wonder why I ever thought that was a good idea. Either way though, my mom always believed in me and would help me put together a portfolio and paid for all my agency fees too, and they were not cheap. When I realized that my agency didn't care to book me for any gigs because I wasn't a good fit for anything, I searched for gigs myself. Keep in mind I was only 15, so I wasn't the most discerning person. I joined up with this website where models could contact photographers and vice versa. I was contacted by many photographers, and one particular guy stood out to me. He told me he would pay me for the hour and travel, since he lived about 3 hours away from me. I thought that was a great deal. I talked to my mom about the opportunity, and she agreed to take me if my dad and sister could come too. I agreed, although I did feel like it was going to look unprofessional. When we arrived to this place, this guy's house was in a wooded area with no neighbors around. It was a very big house though. Honestly, probably the biggest I've ever seen at that point in my life. He had a barn to the side that was bigger than my actual house. When we went to his door, his wife answered it. She seemed like a normal, nice, white, stay-at-home mom. She told us to sit in the living room while we waited. The furniture and everything was so nice. I felt bad for even sitting down on it. Her husband came out, and to be honest, I forgot what he even looked like. They were both such normal-looking white people to me. His wife was folding laundry. Everything just seemed so casual. I noticed she was folding children's clothes, but they didn't seem to have any kids around. I also didn't remember her mentioning anything about having kids either. The man took us into his office, and we did all the paperwork. He had tax forms and all this other stuff that seemed legit enough. Now I felt less afraid about being slaughtered in the Wisconsin woods with my whole family. The weird thing though was that he asked what my stage name would be. Why the fuck would I need a stage name for these pictures? Once the paperwork was done, he took us to his barn to look at the studio. It was huge and also looked super legit. He had clothing racks full of costumes, bright lights, computers. It was pretty overwhelming. When I started, he told me I could change since I'd brought my own clothes. I was super nervous, of course, since the only experience I had in modeling was having my aunt take pictures of me in the backyard. The photographer said to my family, "Kids are usually nervous if their family is watching them. Are you guys fine with stepping out for a bit?" They agreed. My dad told me in our language to scream if anything happened because they'd be right there. I figured I'd be fine. That was until the photographer casually said to me, "Can you pull your sleeve down over your shoulder? It's okay if a nipple shows, I can just Photoshop it out." Immediately, I got the heebie-jeebies. After about 5 minutes, I asked him if I could take a break. He agreed and asked if I wanted to see the pictures. When I gazed at them, they didn't look like the super professional photography photos I was expecting. They looked super fucking average. My aunt was only 17 and she was taking way better pictures of me than this guy. He asked if I wanted to do some more. I told him I wanted to talk to my parents first. I told my mom I didn't want to do this anymore. They somehow managed to get me out and drove me home. It was very silent. I think my parents knew what was going on. My sister had told me that when she tried to go into the barn to check up on me, the door was locked shut. I later found out that the website he was running was actually a child pornography site. He had to pay to unlock the photos. It was this big, huge scandal. His website was full of kids in swimming suits looking like adults on his homepage. All the girls had stage names too. Now it made sense why he and his wife had come off as too perfect and lived in such a huge house. They were profiting off naive young girls' dreams. I'm just grateful my parents loved me enough to not push me further into that shit. I know most of those girls did not want to do that kind of stuff. Oh, and the dude never paid us for the food or travel either. In fact, he actually stole my birth certificate because we'd accidentally left it in his office when we went to take the photos. I hope he died shortly after, or got arrested at least. Now I'm afraid to take professional photos subconsciously, and I never want to be in the spotlight ever again. Trigger warning. This story contains descriptions of domestic violence. Years ago, I pushed really hard to make sure my daughter got a cell phone at a pretty early age, around 12 years old. My former spouse didn't really understand why this was such a huge deal for me. I couldn't really explain it at the time either, but I had my reasons why I needed her to have a phone. Part of this was from my own experience as a young 14-year-old babysitter. I loved babysitting for Jack and Diane. Not only were they the coolest couple ever, but their kids were really sweet and fun too. They had a little toddler boy, Matt, and John, the little baby. Jack was a biker, and he often picked me up on his Harley. That was the most amazing thing ever, and his wife loaned me a lot of her leather clothes to wear to rock concerts. They went out partying a lot, and paid really well too. It was like a dream job almost. They were out clubbing that night. I had put Matt to bed and rocked John off to sleep. It was a cold night, so they had taken the Mercedes instead of the bike. It was so late. Even with checking on the sleeping kids regularly, I was starting to get sleepy myself. That was never really an issue though. They didn't seem to mind at all if I dozed off to sleep, which I did on this night. I woke up with a start, heart pounding. I had no idea at first what had woken me up. Neither of the kids woke up and there was no noise either. For whatever reason though, I was wide awake and terrified. I had just started to get my panic under control when I heard a car door slam shut. I looked out the window. I saw they were now home, so I went to open the front door. As Diane came inside, I could see one side of her face was horribly swollen, and she was bleeding profusely as well. Stupidly, I asked, "Did you get in a fight or something?" She raced past me to the phone at the dining room table and started dialing. It was a heavy old tabletop-style phone. Jack came in next, flying past me and screaming. I saw him grab the phone receiver from her hand and smash it into the side of her head. Blood splattered across the wall. He ripped the phone out of it entirely. She was screaming now, holding her bloody face. He started smashing her head into the wall. Then she staggered, gushing blood into the bedroom out of sight. I could hear more screaming and the hideous sounds of blows landing. She came tumbling out of the bedroom, thrown through the hallway and into the crib, waking John. She crawled out of the room as he started to cry, and Jack dragged her into the hallway and screamed at the baby to shut the fuck up. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I ran and grabbed the baby out of the crib, cuddling him and turning him away from the image of his dad, straddling his mom and choking her. The silence that settled in after was almost scarier than the screaming. I honestly couldn't tell whether she was dead or not. I got John settled in again and came back out into the living room. I didn't know what to do. Diane was laying there on the floor, broken, bleeding, and barely recognizable. I couldn't even tell if she was still breathing. Jack told me to sit down as he dialed the number on his cell phone. I slowly perched on the edge of the couch. Diane crawled to me then, gurgling words through blood. She begged me to protect her babies. I just kept thinking that I was just a kid too. Soon, a bunch of Jack's buddies arrived. A few of them said they would take Diane to the hospital. Jack asked if I would stay with the kids, but Diane started screaming that if I stayed there, he would rape and kill me. I told them I just wanted to go home. One of the guys said he would call his wife to come stay with the kids instead, and they left with Diane. Jack then looked over to me and told me to get in the car. He would be taking me home. I had no way to call for help or a different ride. The whole way home, I just tried to stay as calm as possible. The turn to my street was at the bottom of a dip. As we approached that turn, Jack just kept telling me over and over how he could not go back to prison. He would do anything to not go back. I kept nodding and agreeing as he took his foot off the brake and drove past the turn. I looked at him horrified. "I just want to talk. I need to calm down before I go home to my kids, okay?" We ended up at an all-night donut shop. He had coffee and a donut. He got me something too and spent more than the next hour telling me how he was not a bad guy. Prison had changed him. I was less than 5 kilometers from my home now, but I had no way to call for help, and no one knew where I was. I just tried to be supportive and agreed with everything he said. He paid me $50, which was a lot for back then. Finally, we got back into the car, and he drove me home after. It was one of the longest nights ever. I woke up to a police cruiser outside my house. Diane refused to press charges. About a week later, I got a letter from her apologizing for everything, taking all of the blame. Sometimes I wonder if he killed her in the end. I wonder if those kids somehow grew up to be good people, even with all of that going on around them. So yeah, that's the one reason why I made sure my daughter always had a way to call for help if anything happened. Last night, my roommate and I made a last-minute decision to go night swimming at the river in our city. It was around 8 p.m. or so there were still a few people hanging out in the area. It was extremely dark though. About 15 minutes after we arrived there, I saw a man shining his flashlight, seemingly looking for something near where we'd put our stuff. "Hey, keep an eye out on that guy," I said to my roommate semi-loud. The man obviously heard me say this and scurried away immediately. I began to feel a bit anxious at seeing this happen, but I waited a bit to say something else to my roommate. Eventually though, I did. We decided it was time to leave. We packed all our stuff up and began to walk up the staircase that led back to the parking lot, using our flashlights to see the steps. Out of the corner of my eye though, I saw a dark shadow dodge into some bushes at the very top and stop moving. I stopped immediately. I grabbed my roommate's arm and redirected them, and we started walking back down the stairs. I told my roommate what I'd seen at the top when we got to the bottom. She said it was probably just a tree blowing in the wind or something. I started, though, to get the strangest feeling in my stomach. I'd never felt anything like this before, ever. I just knew if we went back up those stairs, something bad was going to happen to both of us. I stood there at the bottom of those stairs and began to shine my light slowly up to the top, trying to see if I could see anyone there. Sure enough, for a brief moment, I could see the outline of a man hiding. As soon as the light hit him though, he ducked down behind the bushes once again. Obviously, I went into full-blown panic mode. I started looking for other people there, hoping someone could walk us to our car. Luckily, we found a couple not far away. They walked us to our car but seemed quite annoyed about it. When we got to the top of the steps though, the man who was hiding in the bushes was nowhere to be seen. A few hours after we got home, I got a notification on my Neighbors app, the Ring doorbell app that sends crime alerts for your area. Someone had been stabbed, only a few streets away from where we had been. I'm 100% certain this guy's intentions were bad. I don't know if he was planning on kidnapping us or robbing us or stabbing us. I just know something really bad would have happened if I hadn't been paying attention and we'd simply walked up those stairs. Not sure if he was the person that stabbed someone, but that notification just scared me even more. I'm still sick to my stomach because of all of this. This happened June 2018 in Portland, Oregon. I understand I acted like an idiot in this situation. Since then, I've become much more observant, cautious, and honestly more paranoid. This night, I had gone dancing with my friends. and was really drunk by midnight. Unfortunately, this is back when I had very little money. I realized you could save money by eating very little before going out, and it would take far fewer drinks to get drunk. It worked so well that I was barely able to even remember my friend ordering me an Uber ride home. My phone was dead, of course. I can vaguely recall them helping me into the car and telling me to get home safe. I don't even remember greeting the driver or the first minute or so of the ride. Soon after getting in, he asked me how my night was and if I smoked. Honestly, I was just thinking about bed at this point, so I sorta slurred out that I did sometimes. He then offered me a joint. This was the first moment I got real nervous and began paying attention. I told him I was really tired and just ready to get home instead. I think he said something about it being an indica-based joint and it making for a great sleep aid. Once again, I said something not exactly like no, but not a yes either. Well, he took that as, yes, I'll take that joint right now, please. Once again, I was drunk enough that I could barely even see or speak. So when he said, okay, well, I have to cancel the ride real quick. I can't give this to you while I'm on the clock. It took me a second to realize what was really going on. By the time I started to say something, he had canceled the ride and pulled over to the side of the road. We were now in an area just east of the Hawthorne Bridge. It was totally secluded, just empty parking lots and closed shops around, not a single person in sight. It was starting to hit me that I was now in the car not with an Uber driver, but with some stranger, and I couldn't call anyone to help. He was also apparently trying to give me weed he'd rolled himself, which could have anything in it. For the next minute or so, we were pretty quiet. I can't remember any small talk he tried to make. I was beginning to panic. I tuned nearly everything out. Every time he handed me the joint, I would take fake hits, just breathing it into my mouth and not into my lungs. I felt extremely tired, clumsy, and weak. That kind of drunk where you're almost to the point of nausea. I knew there wasn't really much of anything I could do to defend myself at this point. I remember being vividly fixated for a moment on the fact I didn't even have a pair of keys to defend myself with, as my building used fobs for just about everything. I didn't take my mail key with me either. As I was freaking out, I looked up to see if the man was noticing. I made eye contact with him in the mirror. I could see the entire time he was staring at me, but I couldn't read his expression. Finally, though, he said something along the lines of, "All right, well, let's get out of here now." I told him I'd just call another Uber to get home. I was thinking at this point it might just be safer to walk. No, I still got your address. I'll just take you home myself. For a moment, I was relieved. I guess I wanted to believe so badly that I would get home safe that I just believed him. I tried to calm down. After all, he hadn't actually done anything threatening. Maybe he was just a stoner guy and I was overreacting. At this time, I lived on PSU campus in downtown Portland, in the southwest area of the city. He was driving me north on the east side of the river. There were several bridges to our left. He kept moving north though. He had several opportunities to take an exit to hop over the river and get me back downtown, but he kept on skipping them. We passed bridge after bridge that could get me home. Up in northeast Portland, there are some large industrial areas that get very isolated at night. Portland is also surrounded by a lot of forests. I knew he was taking me to a secluded area. After he passed the fourth exit for a bridge, pretty sure it was the Broadway Bridge, I was racking my brain for a way to make him actually take me home. Hey, my boyfriend is waiting for me, so can we get on track? This was true, though I said it in a very meek way. The man didn't say anything. He did take the next exit for a bridge though, and basically hung a giant U-turn that started actually taking me home. Even as we were on the west side of town heading south, I was still shaking. I had my hand on the door handle, thinking about hopping out at a red light the closer we got to my apartment. My phone was completely dead. And honestly, there were still several chances to hop onto nearby highways and speed out of the city. We were getting close to my apartment now though. Once again, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe some stoner that was too high to navigate the city or something. I was so scared I was almost crying. Once we got about 2 blocks away from my apartment, I lied and told him it was easiest to stop here. He could just let me out. Again, he didn't say anything. He did slow down the car. I was flooded with relief and could even feel myself smiling. When I went to open the door though, I realized it was locked. I tried to lift the lock mechanism manually, but it wouldn't budge at all. I looked up at him instinctively to see what was happening. He had his head turned almost fully toward me, shoulders still facing the road, giving me the most sinister smile I had ever seen. It was so smug and mocking, and it didn't reach his eyes at all. I just started crying and begging him to open the door. I was freaked out and very drunk. After a moment of watching me cry, he finally did unlock it. I never forgot that sensation of vulnerability though, not just being drunk in his car with no way to contact anyone, but even as I got out, I kept feeling like he would grab the back of my shirt and pull me back in. When I got home, I found out my boyfriend had actually gone out with friends last minute and wasn't even there. He wouldn't even have known till much later that I hadn't gotten back safe. The next day, I convinced myself I was just freaking out over nothing. In my gut though, I had truly felt in danger the night before. Technically, this guy could have been totally harmless, but I still think I should have texted my friend and had her report him. The big thing that made me think of this though was recently hearing about how Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, would go for practice runs, picking up hitchhikers and seeing if he could get the passengers and potential victims to trust him and how far out of his comfort zone he could push them without them saying anything. Obviously, this guy was not Ed Kemper, but I hate wondering if that night was a practice run of sorts for that Uber driver. Anyway, thanks to whoever reads this whole thing through, I'm at a point in my life where I'm realizing how much danger I put myself in when I was younger and just depressed as hell. It's made me both surprised and deeply grateful I'm still here at all.
If you grow up in England, there's a story that you might hear. One of the old legends that's all but died out in our modern era. It isn't popular anymore, but the tale of the Church Grim still gets whispered around the fires at night and told in hushed tones to curious children. While it isn't as bloody or monstrous as some stories, its power comes from how real it is. The Church Grim is a spirit that oversees the welfare of the church where it was buried, and it helps protect the churchyard from vandals and robbers. Whenever a new graveyard was buried, it was believed that the first person buried there had to spend eternity guarding the other souls from evil. So in order to prevent a human from shouldering this burden, a stray black dog was sacrificed. The Grim was also said to ring church bells the night before a villager died, and they're associated with bringing bad luck to whoever spots one. They often appear as black dogs with red eyes, but other animals such as pigs and lambs have also been used as guardians of the church. There are countless records of people encountering this type of spirit, and even some of the most devout, honest churchgoers have sworn they have seen it. When I was 8, my grandma told me all of this, which had been passed down from her family who came to the United States from Tewkesbury, England. I'm now ashamed to admit it, but back then I didn't believe her. I called her a liar and told her the ghosts aren't real. I remember how sad she looked at me. I wish I had trusted her words, but I guess I had to learn my lesson the hard way. One night, not long after I turned 17, I was coming back from my boyfriend Max's house. A thick blanket of dark clouds had gathered that night, and I was hurrying so that I wouldn't get caught in the storm. Mist had started to creep across the ground, and I was trying to not trip when I heard a whimper. The noise was most definitely coming from inside the graveyard, which nearly made me decide not to go in. There had been a string of people finished in this area lately by some unknown assailant, and since I didn't have any form of protection on me, I didn't want to get caught alone and meet their sticky end as well. Then the sound came again, and my heart twisted. I couldn't just ignore an animal that was in trouble, so I took a nervous breath and pushed open the wrought iron gate. I cringed as the hinges squeaked, but I resolutely continued forward. I called quietly to the dog as I weaved among the headstones, but in the gathering mist, my foam flashlight wasn't doing me much good. I thought I saw its eyes glinting once, but it was just the jeweled eyes of a doll leaning up against a headstone. I was about to abandon my search, especially since my thin sneakers were beginning to soak through, when I saw a little black puppy. It was curled up next to an unmarked gravestone in the furthest corner of the graveyard, and even 10 feet away from it I could see it shivering. I called out to it and smiled as it perked its ears towards me. "Hey little pup, come here." My voice carried the excited tone that most dogs love, but the puppy ignored me. I moved in closer, and when it didn't try to run away, I gently scooped it up. It let out another whimper, and I began checking it over since it sounded like it could be hurt. As I was examining it, I noticed that it was wearing a raggedy old collar with a tag, and apparently his name was Kirk. He seemed fine, and he had even given me a friendly, tentative lick. "Hey Kirk, it's okay boy. I'm gonna bring you home with me. Then tomorrow I'll figure out where you live and get you home." He gave me a happy little woof, and I could almost believe that he understood me. I was about to turn around and head for the gate, when Kirk jumped out of my arms, his hackles raised. I didn't see anything, but I heard the hushed sounds of voices. I quickly shut off my light, scuttling quietly over to a larger gravestone to try and hide myself. I paused carefully, not to make a sound, as I panicked as the voices became clearer. "Are you sure she's there?" "Yeah, definitely. Saw her light over that way." "When we catch her, gonna make sure she can't sit for a week. Then we cut her throat. Slice her up just like the others." I had heard enough. I needed to get out of there, and I frantically tried to get Kirk's attention. He wouldn't turn his head though, and his hackles were slowly rising. I was starting to shake, but before I could move to pick him up, his eyes began glowing. I halted, my hand outstretched towards him, and I blinked rapidly. At first I thought I was imagining things, or that the two men had some sort of red light that I was seeing, but I quickly ruled out those possibilities. Kirk's eyes were glowing a ruby red in the darkness, and no amount of blinking was making it change. "Kirk?" My voice sounded tiny, and for a moment, I had regressed to my 5-year-old self, when I believed there was a monster under my bed. I hadn't believed in the paranormal for 12 years, so this was kicking me pretty far out of my comfort zone. I was still down on my knees, my hands outstretched, when Kirk began growling. I could see him as well, but I watched as the level of his eyes began to rise, and he let out a bone-chilling howl, and I could hear the anger and sadness woven into it. As the last note faded into the mist, I heard one of the men let out a surprised shout as Kirk bounded towards them. I quickly lost sight of him, but I could hear the anguished screams and the sounds of tearing flesh coming from the men. One of them shot a gun, but either they missed or it had no effect on Kirk. About 5 minutes ticked by, each one feeling slower than the last, before I heard Kirk coming back to me. I turned my flashlight on instantly, regretting my decision. Kirk had returned to his puppy form, but he was dragging an arm with him like it was a stick. He dropped the macabre gift at my feet, crouching down and waggling his little tail playfully. I half laughed and half sobbed, and before I could think, I picked him up and hugged him. I realized I wasn't afraid of him at all, and my grandma's words about not judging a book by its cover crossed my mind. "Thank you, good boy. Thank you so much." He licked the tears that were streaming down my cheeks until I stopped crying, and he nudged his head against mine with a happy woof. I sat him back down, then pulled myself unsteadily to my feet with the help of the headstone. I was still trembling, but I was able to step carefully over the arm and get myself past the bodies without vomiting. Kirk followed me, weaving playfully around my ankles like he was herding a sheep. When I reached the gate, he stopped, whining sadly as I passed through the wrought iron. I looked back at him and wondered what would happen if he passed through. Could he even do it? I realized Kirk wasn't a typical dog, but this didn't stop me from wanting to take care of him. I figured it was worth a shot, and in the worst case scenario, he would remain trapped here. I squatted down, clapping my hands together excitedly to call me to him. "Kirk, come here, boy, come on." He ran towards me, wagging his tail. Just as he hit the line of the gate, he crumpled, and it looked like he had slammed head first into an invisible wall. I felt my heart wrench painfully, and I wanted him to be able to leave his phantasmal prison. I walked over to him, picking him up and gently cradling him in my chest. He felt so solid and so alive, and even knowing what he was, I couldn't bring myself to abandon my little hero. His loneliness was palatable when I first saw him, and I didn't want him stuck like this. I carried him to the gate, stopping just shy of the threshold, and I had no idea what to do. But a memory came floating back to me. My grandpa had been a preacher, and I recalled how he said during one of his sermons that sometimes spirits just need someone to tell them it was okay to be free. I knew that I was risking the chance that Kirk could simply disappear, but I wanted him to be free. I took a breath. "Kirk, I release you from your spirit guardian duties. You are free to travel wherever you want." My voice had gained confidence as I spoke, and by the end I was sweeping an arm out in a hand gesture, as though I could make the gate allow Kirk to pass through by sheer force of will. He had held practically still this whole time, and he hadn't even tried to squirm around or jump down like a normal puppy. I looked down at his furry little face, closed my eyes, and took a step forward. When I opened them, I was on the other side of the gate, but my arms were empty. I spun around, but Kirk wasn't on the other side. I called to him and checked inside the graveyard, but couldn't find him. My shoulders drooped as I let out a defeated sigh and began walking home, my soaked sneakers making a sad squish sound as I made my way through 1.5 miles of near darkness. My phone had died at some point, but I knew the route well enough that I could still navigate it just fine. I finally caught sight of my apartment stop, and sitting on the topmost step was a little black puppy. It was Kirk. I ran up to him, and he barked excitedly. As I went to reach for him, he jumped, landing in my arms in an ungraceful wiggling ball of fur. That night was now 4 years ago, and every once in a while Kirk gives me a special bark to let me know that he has to go and take care of some business. My daughter Celia loves him, and he likes to watch over her as she learns to walk. Max and I have a bit of an odd family, but we wouldn't change it for the world. I am a 17-year-old girl. My neighborhood is located in a small town, so we all know each other here. When I was 15, I was walking by a park near my house when a guy I've never seen before approached me and started making small talk with me. As an anxious person, small talk is an enemy, so I was already feeling uncomfortable, but still being polite and nice to him, because I don't really know how to be rude to strangers. As we walk, he tells me his name is Mark, and he says that he lives a street away from my house. I tell him my name, and after some trivial questions about the day and stuff, he asks me, "Did you used to have purple hair? That looked really good on you." That was when I was 13. I remind you, I don't know him. I've never seen him before. How the hell did he know and remember that? Whatever, I brushed it off. But every time he asked something about me, it gave me the impression that he was trying to get info out of me. I said goodbye to him after a few more words, as I had to catch the bus to school, and went away. A few weeks later, as I'm leaving my house to go to the bus stop, I see Mark walking from where he told me his house was to the stop as well. I start walking, and he slows his walk to approach me. I think, there's no way out of this. I have to speak to him now. He started making conversation with me, and I kept my answers short, mostly because I still felt uncomfortable with his too personal questions, but he still played the nice guy. I didn't get verbal, but I started dropping hints about me being awkward, like putting on my headphones again or stopping to search something in my backpack. Nothing could stop him from talking to me. When we got to the bus stop, 3 buses were coming and he asked me which one I was going to take. I told him, and he got on the same bus as me. Once on the bus, all of the individual seats were taken, so I had to sit on a double one. He sat next to me and still talked to me. He told me he was 23, that he's in college, and it's one that's near my school. Great. He spoke to me the whole trip, and when I got up off the seat to leave the bus, he also stood up and said to me that his stop was on the other side, but he wanted to walk with me. I wanted to die at this point. This happened multiple times. Once at the end of the semester, I hadn't slept in 35 hours because I had a huge test that morning. I was reading my notes and texts at the time, but then Mark appears at the bus stop out of nowhere. I didn't have the energy to speak to him, so I tried to pretend I hadn't seen him and kept reading. Obviously that didn't work, and he began speaking to me. I told him I was studying for a big test and that I hadn't slept in a long time, and I thought that out of respect that would keep him quiet. But guess what? It didn't. He started asking me about my grades, my tests, and I barely answered, but still was polite. And whenever I tried starting reading my notes again, he would keep talking. I had to change my routine and take the next bus so that I wouldn't meet Mark. That would mean, though, I'd be 10 minutes late to every class, but I didn't care. I just didn't want to see him. I spoke to my mum about this, and she knew the guy only from seeing him around the neighborhood, and she thought he's only a little intense, and that my anxiety was making me overthink about him. But I had a gut feeling. I didn't like him. I told my mum's friend, as she lives across the street and has been here a good 35 years, and she knew Mark since he was a baby. She told me that he's a good guy, but he doesn't speak to anyone, except me. I saw him around a few times, but whenever I saw him, I did whatever I could to avoid him. Sometimes I could escape, other times he would approach me. Fast forward to mid-last month. There had been multiple house robberies in the zone, so the neighbors decided to make a WhatsApp group chat so they could let each other know if something was wrong in the neighborhood, and alarms were installed in all of the houses. I'm not in the group, but my mum is, and so's Mark. When the group was made, everyone introduced themselves with their addresses. My mum doesn't have a profile picture of herself on WhatsApp, and a few weeks ago I went to my dad's house, and when I got home from the day, my mum told me that she woke up at 2 a.m. with 3 missed calls from Mark. She tried to call him, he picked up but he didn't speak. Just listened. My mum said, "Hello?" and he hung up. It gave me goosebumps when she told me that. I always knew there was something about him that was off, but this is just too much. I told her I find him more and more terrifying with time, and she told me she'd keep an eye on him. Yesterday, my mum handed me her phone for me to send myself a picture. She was sitting right beside me and could see what I was doing. I quickly saw 2 unread messages from Mark asking her something about the neighborhood alarm. The messages were about 6 hours old, and since I told her before that Mark repulses and scares me, she didn't tell me he'd talked to her. She saw me seeing that and got a little nervous, but I pretended I didn't see it. Why, of all 40 neighbors in the group chat, did he speak to my mum? I really didn't want to know about this. Should I consider him a stalker or just a weirdo? What should I do? No matter what though, I do hope to not bump into him again. In 2013, I moved into an apartment in Alma, Arkansas. I'm not sure if this had anything to do with it, but the apartment complex was right next to a very old graveyard. A little history on this apartment complex. I had lived there 3 times before: 2003, 2006, and 2009. Each time I got the same 1-bedroom apartment, number 208. It was always the only 1-bedroom available. Each time, I would have strange things happen there. The first time cabinets would open, things would be in different places, and sometimes when I'd take a shower and close my eyes, I'd see the bathroom and shower covered in blood and blood coming out the shower. I'd open my eyes, and it would be normal. The first time I lived there, that stuff intrigued me. I only moved out to move in with my girlfriend. Alma has very few options for apartments, and in 2006, when my girlfriend and I split up, I had to go back to the same apartment complex, and lo and behold, the exact same day I split with my girlfriend, the people living in 208 suddenly move out, and for the second time, I got the same apartment. It seemed a little weird, but I just wrote it off as a coincidence. This time, things were worse. I'd hear movements in my walk-in wardrobe and living room at night. The shower visions were more intense, and also while I was living here, did I get sleep paralysis. My first sleep paralysis episode was terrifying. I was laying asleep on the ground next to my new girlfriend, and at about 1 AM, I heard a DVD rack in the living room fall, and a lot of DVDs crashing to the floor. I was still half asleep when I looked towards my bedroom door, which I kept shut, and on this night, I had accidentally left my bathroom light on, and I could see the light right under the doors, but as I turned my head to the direction of the noise, and was about to holler out who's there, I hear running footsteps, like a kid. Then I saw the shadow of feet at the base of my bedroom door, in the bathroom light. No filler shadow, just the feet, and in a blink of an eye they moved from the door to my chest and disappeared. This all happened so fast, and I couldn't move or speak. But after seeing the shadow feet on my chest, I went to shake my girlfriend awake, but my arms couldn't move. So I say her name, but I couldn't speak. So in panic I try and sit up, but couldn't move at all. My eyes began to get heavy, and in a second I was dreaming of a shadow holding me down, covering my mouth. I fought and widened my eyes, and it was still there. I'm finally able to make noise, but it's just a raspy, pitiful help that is barely a whisper, and I'm able to slightly move my finger and touch my girlfriend. It's enough, and she opens her eyes and asks me what's wrong. I let out my pitiful help again as I widen my eyes in fear at my chest. My girlfriend starts shaking me, and when I don't respond, she slaps me. In an instant, the shadow is gone, and I'm awake and able to move. My girlfriend says she never heard the DVDs crashing and did not see the shadow. The DVDs were all still on the rack when I go to check the living room. My girlfriend witnessed and pulled me out of 3 more sleep paralysis episodes over the next few months, before leaving me because it freaked her out so badly. And then I moved out. Fast forward to 2009. I had married in 2007 and had a son that same year and a daughter in 2009. But my wife and I split, and I needed a place to stay, and once again had to go back to the same apartment complex. I couldn't afford anything better. Once again, for the 3rd time, the only apartment available is 208. But I didn't want to be homeless, so I asked the landlord if I could move into 208, and if it could be temporary. If another apartment opens up, he'll let it to me. He says yes, and I move in. But after 2 weeks of bloody visions, noises, and 2 more sleep paralysis episodes, I move out and stay with family. My wife and I got back together in 2013. We split for good and got split custody, and I needed a local place to live. And because this time I needed a 2-bedroom apartment, and knowing there is no chance of getting 208 because it's 1 bedroom, I go back to the complex and ended up getting 210, which is right next to 208. The even number apartments are on the 2nd floor, the odd on the bottom. 210 was the only available 2-bedroom apartment, so I take it and tell myself at least it's not 208. Nothing happened. At first, my kids and I really make it our home, and then it begins. One night I'm in my room and it's 2:30 in the morning, and I hear my kids banging toys around and giggling in their room, and I heard the TV come on, and it wakes me up. Irritated, I call out, "You guys are supposed to be asleep. Don't make me ground you." The banging and giggling stops, but I still hear the TV going, and I get up and walk to their shut doors, still half asleep, and say, "Okay, kiddos, I told you to go back to..." As I begin opening their door, it occurs to me that my kids are at their mum's. I had taken them back to her the evening before. A chill runs down my body as I slowly push the door open and see toys strewn all about and cartoons playing on TV. I turn the lights on, unplug the TV, and then bolt to the living room, shutting their door behind me. I turned all the lights on in the apartment and sat up on edge all night. Nothing else happens, but the next week, while my kids were there, I'd catch my 3-year-old daughter talking to somebody when my 6-year-old son wasn't around her. So I asked her who she talked to, and she replied, "My friend's old mum. Her kid got burned up, so she's nice to me because I look like her little girl." My daughter said this word for word, and usually she couldn't talk that plain. I immediately called her mum and asked her who'd she been having watch over them, but she says that it's just cartoons. I once again got a chill down my entire body. My son never saw what Alexis saw. Over the next few months, my little girl continued to talk about old mum, sometimes even pointing behind me telling me she's watching me to make sure I'm a good daddy. Very creepy. Over the past few years, my little girl has gotten to like spooky stuff and is fascinated with scary shows and movies. But at this time she was only 3 and had never even seen scary stuff, so I was really getting concerned and had a hard time sleeping. Then one night, I was reading a kid's book called The Monster in My Closet to my kids. They lay in bed as I was sitting in the chair next to the bed, and at the end of the book is a page that says for the kid reading to draw the monster in their closet. This gave me an idea. I told my daughter to draw the old mum for me. She sits up, I give her a pencil and the book, and she says, "Can you move, Daddy? She's behind you and I can't see her." I scoot away a little, and my girl looks in the direction where I sat before, then looks down, draws a little, looks up again, then draws some more, and continues to do this until she finishes. She hands me the picture. I look at it, and I begin to tremble and my heart races. That weekend, we moved to an apartment in the next town over. Some might say it was her imagination and she just made up the drawing. But she was 3, and I believe if she made it up, she wouldn't have taken her eyes off the paper as she drew it. But she kept looking up as she drew, and that tells me she was looking at old Mum while drawing her, in order to reference. Now that you can see the drawing, you will understand why we moved. I have been roofied 3 times, once in high school and twice when I was in college. I am no stranger to the effects of it, and it's a brutal experience as a whole. My worst was the 3rd time it happened, and hopefully the last. At the time, I was about 22 years old and finishing up college. I was using Tinder and had met a few folks. We chatted, had gone on some dates, but nothing very serious ever came of it. This one week, I had 2 dates planned. The first one on the Friday with an EMT for sushi and drinks, and the other one to the state fair on Sunday. Come Friday, I ironically had left a note for my roommate at the time with the EMT Tinder guy's name, his Facebook info and general info because of my hyper paranoia. Hooray, anxiety. He picked me up and we went to sushi. First and foremost, he had to be one of the rudest people I have ever encountered. I'm talking yelling at waitstaff, complaining about everything, and generally being a dickhole. I was completely over any interest in this guy almost immediately, but I didn't want to be rude and ruin the date. So I finished my beverage, excused myself to the bathroom, and mass texted some friends about meeting up downtown so they could come and save me from him. A pair of friends were already planning on going out, so agreed to meet me. In the meantime, this guy and I go to a local bar and grab a beer. I buy us 2 bottles, trying to be smart, having been roofied before, and don't let it leave my sight. We drink them, and he, of course, continues to be the king of douche. Eventually he asks if we want to go somewhere else, since it was encroaching the time my friend said they would be going downtown to meet me. I suggested the spot where the save was going to go down. We walk there, burning off the 2.5 rolls of sushi I ate, 1 margarita at dinner, and 1 beer from the last place. Now keep in mind that I am not a lightweight. I'm 5'8", 135 pounds, and I can handle my drink, especially when spread out over the course of about 3 or so hours. We arrive at the bar, grab another drink, and I order a vodka and soda, while he has a beer. We go and sit at the table, positioned so that I can see the front door, and sort of chat, as I'm really not trying to say anything rude to him for the way he treated the people at the restaurant and more. Finally, my friends walk in, and I jump up and call their names. Thank goodness they're here. They walk over, say hi, and I half introduce them to the Tinder turd and step away from the table to give them a hug and ask them to come with me to the bathroom. I turn back towards the table where the guy is sitting, also where I left my drink for about 2 minutes, and my friends and I head to the bathroom to plot the escape strategy. The plan was for me to go with them to the bar, get a drink, and we would get lost in the crowd. They'd get a beer, and we would head out. It worked just like that too. I finished my drink, walked out the bathroom with them to get to the bar, and they chugged a beer, and we went to walk out of the sight of this dude. At this point, it was like my world started spinning. I feel really loopy and know something isn't right, but I push myself to get out the bar thinking maybe it's just anxiety of me ditching this dude. As we walk out the bar, I start blacking out and vaguely remember my arms around my friends as we walk down the side street towards another bar. It seems that the guy saw us leaving and he comes running out after us. He proceeds to ask my friends if I'm okay and where I'm going. Can he come with? Are they sure that I'm okay and that maybe he should take me home? They tell him to get lost and that we're going to see a friend of ours down the block, and he leaves. The next thing I remember is waking up the next day. Vomit everywhere, no clothes, and bruises all over my body, and a wicked headache. Apparently the rest of my night went like this. I kept telling my friends, "Guys, I think something was put in my drink." But they thought I was saying, "I think I'm drunk," and didn't know how much I drank before I'd met them. At one bar during the night with them, I collapsed in the middle of the dance floor, and security had to carry me out. My friends opted not to call an ambulance and sat me at a table just outside the bar. They called the last person I messaged, which was the second Tinder date I was supposed to have later in the week. Side note, I hadn't met them yet, and said that I was really messed up and asked if he could come and get me to take me home. He did. Apparently, in the car home, I was quiet and just kept saying that I had been slipped something, and kept asking who he was. When we arrived at my house, I opened the door and began to projectile vomit all over the parking lot. Being that I could hardly stand, I was collapsing onto the pavement, slamming into cars. To the would-be Tinder date that just brought me home, picked me up and carried me into my house. He got me into my room, and I crawled into the bathroom, making a lot more noise and more. My roommate came out of her room and was like, "Who the hell are you? What did you do to her?" And is ripping into this dude who genuinely did a really good thing by helping me when he didn't even know me. He explains to her what he knew, what I kept telling him, and that he was just helping me get home safe. At that point, there was a loud thud in the bathroom. Apparently, I had stripped down into my undies, thrown up all over, and attempted to throw up again, slipped on my bath mat, and slammed my head onto the side porcelain bathtub, leading to a very bad concussion. My roommate is freaking out, and tried to tie up my vomit-soaked hair while I'm trying to crawl out the bathroom and cry. The Tinder date who helped me leaves. I wake up in shock, covered in bruises and vomit with a massive concussion. What sucks the most is that after my friends convinced me to go to the ER to get myself looked at, the doctor gave me a massive lecture on mixing alcohol with illegal substances. There was a plethora of anti-anxiety medication and sedatives in my system with some alcohol, of which I had been prescribed some of the anxiety meds in the past, but knew better than to drink and take them because they can seriously mess you up, and I'd not taken them in about a month because I never got a new prescription. I tried to explain this to the doctor, but she rolled her eyes and alluded to the fact that I seemed like someone who enjoyed a good time and should try to be safer with my decisions next time. To top it all off, I had posted a Snapchat story of my friends with me in the hospital, with a shout out to their support in being there for me for hours, and the creepy ass guy messaged me, "What are you doing in the hospital? Did something happen to you last night? I hope you didn't think I did anything to you." Okay, yeah buddy, that doesn't scream guilt at all. This happened in 1999, Western Australia. I stood as a 19-year-old who was an active volunteer firefighter. I was still working in the town I grew up in, being in rural Western Australia, and I had varied success as an athlete at a state level, but my passion was my involvement in the local volunteer fire and rescue service. I was only 16 when I joined the active ranks after spending the years prior as a junior in their running team, which was a pretty full-on sport. I enjoyed all things firefighting, rescue and emergency and response, and had to have a real calling for it, but as I mentioned above, I did have quite a large sporting influence in my life too. I travelled to a nearby town for a field hockey game, and while there, I caught up with an old mate, Wayne, that I was in the state hockey squad with, and we were really close during that time. A few years back, we both left the state hockey scene and gained employment. We ended up being only about 80 kilometers from each other, but had not realized it until today. After the game, Wade and I naturally gravitated towards each other, and spent the rest of the night at the bar just spending time together and catching up on old times, and really enjoying each other's company. Fast forward to midnight, and the bar was closing up, as it does. We were parked pretty close together by chance, with both our intentions, even though driving whilst being inebriated, to go back to our respective homes. Mine being about 80 kilometers away on an unsealed road, but a pretty straight route, with Wayne going to drive to his home, which was about 175 kilometers away, by taking the standard bypass past my town and then cutting back down a long section of highway on the other side leading to his home, which was a farm. I wish I had a story now of how we had a realization that driving after so much drink was definitely not the best idea after drinking so many beers. But hey, I was about to do the exact same thing, so I didn't feel that I could say anything to this guy, and it was pretty common back then. But please, in no way do I condone or defend it. Don't ever do it. So we leaned on the boot of his red Commodore and talked and laughed as we finished the rest of our last beer. And I remember spending a lot of that time giving him slack about his personalized number plate he had on his car that said Crafty, which was an old nickname because he was quite good at his hockey ball handling skills, which caught many good players by surprise, hence the nickname. With promises of catching up again soon, we both parted ways, and I returned home dodging the rural town cop gauntlet and getting home with no problems a little before 1:30 a.m. I showered and got into bed, and then my phone rang for only a second and then it stopped, which showed a missed call from Wayne. So naturally I thought he may have ended up in my town and wanted to party on. So I tried to call back, but it rang 3 or 4 times before I gave up and went to sleep. I woke up again to the sound of 5 or 6 text messages, one after another, like when you turn your phone back on right after a flight. It was about 2:30 a.m, and they were all from Wayne, but all of them were gibberish and pretty much consisted of random letters and other gibberish. So I tried to call again a few times and messaged him, letting him know that if he were around, he could come and crash at my place. If I needed, I could get the missus up out of bed to collect him, even though we would both be dead for doing so. Again, I got nothing back. It was at 2:19 a.m. that my fire brigade pager sounded, with notification that there was a motor vehicle accident on the bypass to the south of the town, location unknown, but that it was about 2/3 of the distance from the main bypass, and that there was a telecommunications van with a yellow flashing light on site, as he was the one who called it in. I was a little under the weather, so I declined to attend on the first call, but after they sounded the brigade's siren repeatedly and set off the pagers again, it was obvious that not an adequate crew had turned out to the station to attend, so I got dressed and got the missus to take me there, which was only a few minutes away. When I arrived, I was the officer in charge, being third in command, with no one higher there, as there were only 4 firefighters, but 5 with me included. So I tasked the group and explained that while I had a few beers earlier, that I would not have turned up if I were unable to perform, and while I would not be driving any appliances, I was comfortable to be OIC, and if anyone had a problem with that, then speak up and I would gladly relinquish command and leave. As I said, we were only 4 guys, and to be honest, none of us had any real idea what was going on, with the longest serving being about 18 months in, and only just finished his induction to firefighting a few months ago. I digress and apologize. So with myself in the passenger seat and 2 others in the main pump, and the other 2 out in front, we made our way to the incident, which was expected to be about 40 minutes away. We intersected and began down the bypass after about 20 minutes, and by now the cold air had snorted me out. I expected to come across not much, perhaps a car rolled over, or not so much damage due to the non-emergency of the call, and the fact that operations had not updated us since turnout. I saw the yellow flashing light long before we made it to the incident, and upon arrival everything changed. It was obvious from the marks on the road leading up to the car that it lost control and ploughed through a stock fence, and beyond that there were huge gouges to the paddock with red paint up the side of a small walled dam that I could not see into, but had a guy in a reflective vest on the top of the bank waving a torch. I got out and tasked the 4 others, and then, as part of my 360-degree appraisal, I walked up the bank and met with an old mate in a vest. The guy in the vest was quite frantic and speaking a mile a minute, with huge hand gestures, with his torch flapping about that periodically illuminated a license plate that was partially submerged, but upside down because the car was on its roof, in the middle of the small dam, with only the back wheels, exhaust pipe and license plate visible. "That license plate," said Crafty. "As a first responder, I believe that you activate a certain mode in times of emergency, and your training and natural abilities come to the front, and as such you perform exceptionally well, and it is only later in the shower or at dinner or another time when the past decides to visit you and you're human." Well, I became human right there. I knew it had been at least 2 hours since that car had landed in the dam, because there was frost already over the marks that Wayne's car had made going into the dam. I did walk the perimeter of the dam, looking to see if Wayne had been ejected, but found nothing. I then returned my focus to the almost completely submerged car, and remember clearly saying, "Oh, mate," in the saddest I have ever heard my own voice. A tow truck arrived about the same time, and he indicated he could hitch it onto the skull, dragging it out, and then sort it out on the paddock, but I really felt that was unacceptable. I was a swimming pool manager at the time, and as such a lifeguard, so I felt it best to go in and collect my friend with dignity before the car was recovered. So at about 4 in the morning, in the middle of winter, being about 6 degrees Celsius, I stripped down to my underwear and waded in the dam, and made my way to the sunken car that I really hoped did not have my friend in it, and perhaps it was at least a car thief or something like that. I had an intrinsically safe torch that I remembered being waterproof due to its design in my right hand, with the lanyard tied around my waist, and I steadied myself with my left hand on the car's chassis and took 8 deep controlled breaths and dove under to where I assumed the driver door was. I had a really hard time locating anything, as just the fact that the car was upside down really throws your perception of where things are, like door handles and such, and the driver's window was still intact, which was not fantastic. I came up for air, and then went again, and was able to find the door handle and get the door open, which was lucky considering I thought the mud would stop it. I put my back to the pillar and used my legs to open the door as much as I could, which was actually quite a long way. I then went back up for air and had to give myself a few minutes to get my breathing sorted as it was so cold. I ducked back down again, and I had to literally hold my torch to the temple of my head so I could only see perhaps 15 or 20 centimeters in front of me, and I entered the driver door. I cannot instill the absolute horror and panic that a man feels when 15 centimeters from his face, a white, dead face of a friend appears, with eyes slightly open and a mouth that was deformed from a broken jaw. I reacted by jumping out of my skin, and I hit my head really hard on the roof. It was just then I felt an absolute calmness, and I knew it was just a task, and that somehow I felt Wayne calling me a chicken for flinching. I felt and put my left arm over his dangling arms, and tried to locate his seatbelt, as he was still strapped in upside down. and I was having some major difficulties locating it in the dark. I went back up to the surface and had to catch my breath, and upon my return I continued searching for the buckle, and when I finally found it, I could not release the seatbelt. It didn't matter how much I pushed the button, or how much I pulled on it, it wouldn't release. I was running short on air, but did not want to go up to get air because I knew I might have difficulty locating the seatbelt buckle again, and I thought that it was so close that only 1 or 2 more seconds and it would come free. Well, my prayers were finally answered. I got the buckle to release, to which I tried to return to the surface to get air, and then returned for the body. However, when I tried to push back and out the car door to the surface, I felt my right wrist snag on something in the car. While I tried to just break the lanyard, it was too strong, and my frantic tugging only made the torch flap about, illuminating sections of a dashboard and Wayne's upper legs and bare stomach, which made me freak out even more. I was already short on air, and now I was doing that gulping action that everyone has done when they hold their breath a little too long, and was getting really scared. It was then that I just stopped, not because of anything profound or an incident. I just really stopped and did nothing. It felt as though I wasn't gasping or dying for air anymore, and I calmly thought to direct the torch to whatever was snagging to calmly free it and let myself go. When I grabbed the torch, I pointed it at my wrist with my left hand and saw that my lanyard had become stuck around the unclasped buckle of the seatbelt that I had undone. I knew exactly where the issue was, and I tried to unloosen it from the buckle, and I really couldn't do it. It was like a warmth coming over me for a few seconds, the fear returning to me, that I was still trapped. It was then that time stood still, and with the untamed torch flapping about, because I was still concentrating on the snag, that I just stopped as the torch illuminated Wayne's face, and he was just looking right into my soul, with normal open eyes and a slight smile on his face. It's as if Wayne said, "It's okay, you're a useless mug, because you don't have to worry about it, and I've got your back. Let me sort it out and get you out of trouble as usual." It was then that Wayne's hand moved purposefully and unhooked the caught lanyard, and just for lack of a better word, left. After surfacing and coughing while regaining my lungs, I looked to the damn bank, and the other firefighters were screaming and pointing. One of them was right there in the water with me in such a frantic state. After I collected Wayne and took him to the dam bank, I put him in an ambulance, and I started to resolve the scene and talk to the guys, and I was made aware of their side of the story. While I had gone under and surfaced a few times, I apparently went under, and as time went by, the guys got increasingly worried when I did not resurface. I explained about my lanyard getting stuck, and that I had to get it free, but I left out my experience with Wayne. However, the guys would not let it go. Apparently I was underwater for over 15 minutes, and after only around 1 minute, one of the guys stripped off and dove in with me. He tells me to this day that he got hold of my legs, and with both feet on the car could not budge me. He even explained that he dove down many times to feel and see where I was trapped to free me, but could never find anything holding me there, and he swears he ran his fingers down both my arms, seeing as they were the two things he thought that could be caught. I woke up every morning at 2:19 a.m. for months after that, until Wayne visited me again, and told me that it was not my fault, and to forgive myself. I've never woken up at 2:19 a.m. again. Every day, I miss my friend. I love you, Wayne. In 2013, I moved into an apartment in Alma, Arkansas. I'm not sure if this had anything to do with it, but the apartment complex was right next to a very old graveyard. A little history on this apartment complex. I had lived there 3 times before: 2003, 2006, and 2009. Each time I got the same 1-bedroom apartment, number 208. It was always the only 1-bedroom available. Each time I would have strange things happen there. The first time cabinets would open, things would be in different places, and sometimes when I'd take a shower and close my eyes, I'd see the bathroom and shower covered in blood and blood coming out the shower. I'd open my eyes and it would be normal. The first time I lived there, that stuff intrigued me. I only moved out to move in with my girlfriend. Alma has very few options for apartments, and in 2006, when my girlfriend and I split up, I had to go back to the same apartment complex, and lo and behold, the exact same day I split with my girlfriend, the people living in 208 suddenly move out, and for the second time, I got the same apartment. It seemed a little weird, but I just wrote it off as a coincidence. This time, things were worse. I'd hear movements in my walk-in wardrobe and living room at night. The shower visions were more intense, and also while I was living here, did I get sleep paralysis. My first sleep paralysis episode was terrifying. I was laying asleep on the ground next to my new girlfriend, and at about 1 AM, I heard a DVD rack in the living room fall, and a lot of DVDs crashing to the floor. I was still half asleep when I looked towards my bedroom door, which I kept shut, and on this night, I had accidentally left my bathroom light on, and I could see the light right under the doors, but as I turned my head to the direction of the noise, and was about to holler out who's there, I hear running footsteps, like a kid. Then I saw the shadow of feet at the base of my bedroom door, in the bathroom light. No filler shadow, just the feet, and in a blink of an eye they moved from the door to my chest and disappeared. This all happened so fast, and I couldn't move or speak. But after seeing the shadow feet on my chest, I went to shake my girlfriend awake, but my arms couldn't move. So I say her name, but I couldn't speak. So in panic I try and sit up, but couldn't move at all. My eyes began to get heavy, and in a second I was dreaming of a shadow holding me down, covering my mouth. I fought and widened my eyes, and it was still there. I'm finally able to make noise, but it's just a raspy, pitiful help that is barely a whisper, and I'm able to slightly move my finger and touch my girlfriend. It's enough, and she opens her eyes and asks me what's wrong. I let out my pitiful help again as I widen my eyes in fear at my chest. My girlfriend starts shaking me, and when I don't respond, she slaps me. In an instant, the shadow is gone, and I'm awake and able to move. My girlfriend says she never heard the DVDs crashing and did not see the shadow. The DVDs were all still on the rack when I go to check the living room. My girlfriend witnessed and pulled me out of 3 more sleep paralysis episodes over the next few months, before leaving me because it freaked her out so badly. And then I moved out. Fast forward to 2009. I had married in 2007 and had a son that same year and a daughter in 2009, but my wife and I split, and I needed a place to stay, and once again had to go back to the same apartment complex. I couldn't afford anything better. Once again, for the 3rd time, the only apartment available is 208. But I didn't want to be homeless, so I asked the landlord if I could move into 208, and if it could be temporary. If another apartment opens up, he'll let it to me. He says yes, and I move in. But after 2 weeks of bloody visions, noises, and 2 more sleep paralysis episodes, I move out and stay with family. My wife and I got back together in 2013. We split for good and got split custody, and I needed a local place to live. And because this time I needed a 2-bedroom apartment, and knowing there is no chance of getting 208 because it's 1 bedroom, I go back to the complex and ended up getting 210, which is right next to 208. The even number apartments are on the 2nd floor, the odd on the bottom. 210 was the only available 2-bedroom apartment, so I take it and tell myself at least it's not 208. Nothing happened. At first, my kids and I really make it our home, and then it begins. One night I'm in my room and it's 2:30 in the morning, and I hear my kids banging toys around and giggling in their room, and I heard the TV come on and it wakes me up. Irritated, I call out, "You guys are supposed to be asleep. Don't make me ground you." The banging and giggling stops, but I still hear the TV going, and I get up and walk to their shut doors, still half asleep, and say, "Okay, kiddos, I told you to go back to..." As I begin opening their door, it occurs to me that my kids are at their mum's. I had taken them back to her the evening before. A chill runs down my body as I slowly push the door open and see toys strewn all about and cartoons playing on TV. I turn the lights on, unplug the TV, and then bolt to the living room, shutting their door behind me. I turned all the lights on in the apartment and sat up on edge all night. Nothing else happens, but the next week, while my kids were there, I'd catch my 3-year-old daughter talking to somebody when my 6-year-old son wasn't around her. So I asked her who she talked to, and she replied, "My friend's old mum. Her kid got burned up, so she's nice to me because I look like her little girl." My daughter said this word for word, and usually she couldn't talk that plain. I immediately called her mum and asked her who'd she been having watch over them, but she says that it's just cartoons. I once again got a chill down my entire body. My son never saw what Alexis saw. Over the next few months, my little girl continued to talk about old mum, sometimes even pointing behind me telling me she's watching me to make sure I'm a good daddy. Very creepy. Over the past few years, my little girl has gotten to like spooky stuff and is fascinated with scary shows and movies. But at this time she was only 3 and had never even seen scary stuff, so I was really getting concerned and had a hard time sleeping. Then one night, I was reading a kid's book called The Monster in My Closet to my kids. They lay in bed as I was sitting in the chair next to the bed, and at the end of the book is a page that says for the kid reading to draw the monster in their closet. This gave me an idea. I told my daughter to draw the old mum for me. She sits up, I give her a pencil and the book, and she says, "Can you move, Daddy? She's behind you and I can't see her." I scoot away a little, and my girl looks in the direction where I sat before, then looks down, draws a little, looks up again, then draws some more, and continues to do this until she finishes. She hands me the picture. I look at it, and I begin to tremble and my heart races. That weekend, we moved to an apartment in the next town over. Some might say it was her imagination, and she just made up the drawing. But she was 3, and I believe if she made it up, she wouldn't have taken her eyes off the paper as she drew it. But she kept looking up as she drew, and that tells me she was looking at old mum while drawing her, in order to reference. Now that you can see the drawing, you will understand why we moved. I was a busser at a restaurant in Philadelphia during undergraduate school. We had an upstairs bar, and most of the restaurant was on the ground floor. I was working a Friday night once, and we closed around midnight. Early for a bar, but most of our sales were from food. The bartender went back to do bills and whatnot, and I was mopping the upstairs floor near the bar. All of the lights were on, front door locked, and I could hear people on the street outside. Nothing scary. When I heard the front door open and slam, I figured it was our bartender. I look at the stairs and see a guy walk up. I stop mopping and wonder who it is. I'd been working there for 6 months, so I knew all the staff, but I didn't recognize the guy, but figured he was a new dishwasher or something, and clearly had keys to unlock the door. As I'm staring at him, he turns and looks at me, smiles, but keeps walking and heading to the back. I shrug and figure he's going to the office, which is upstairs through the back door, right where he's going. I continue to mop, and the bartender comes out 20 minutes later. I asked who came in. "Nobody," he says. I swear I saw the guy. He checked the front door and it was locked. We searched all over the restaurant and basement. There was no one. Even after reviewing the security camera, there was nothing. To this day, I chalk it up to hallucinating, but I wasn't on any drugs, was healthy, and was neither tired nor hungry. He did have a nice smile though, and it's what I remember most. Just a huge, friendly, goofy grin. I used to nanny for this family that had 3 kids, 2 older girls and a boy of 3. The girls were normal, but the boy would only ever talk about the end. If we played with Legos, he would be sure to finish off his people and voice in this weird deep guttural sound as he described their individual demises. Play with the dog and he'd eventually talk about breaking its neck. Remember, 3-year-old. Colouring would just be him with black and red crayon filling in a whole page. He would whisper threats to his sisters, and if we read a book he would suggest finishing off characters. He was the most morbid child I'd ever met. I don't know where it came from since his parents were real hippy-dippy. I mean all organic eating, no TV watching, and in love with nature people. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. He either had gone through some serious trauma, or he was possessed. Either way, I quit shortly after, when they laughed off my concerns over his mindset. I had just gotten home from Iraq, and I was visiting family up in the country at my grandparents' house. On my way back to my mum's house after dinner, the check engine light flipped on, and I pulled over as soon as I could to check the fluids and such. Breaking down out here is bad, simply due to the narrow roads and the miles you have to go to get anywhere. My mother was supposed to be leaving not long after me, so I sent her a text because calling was futile and decided to look around a bit until she showed up. I had pulled over fairly close to this property alongside the river, but there was a crude wall in the front yard blocking the view from the road. It looked abandoned, so I let myself in. There was a lot of pot growing inside the house. Everything had been gutted, and it was just plants and those heating lamps. I noped out of there faster than I ever have in my life and waited for my mum to put oil in the car. And I was just about to be on my way when this rusty red pickup truck drives by. The driver slows and looks at us, then turns around quickly and pulls up behind us. He was an older guy, and he looked like he hadn't showered in days, wearing blue overalls and no shirt. He jumps out, ran to my mum's car and starts knocking on the window. I'm thinking that this is the end. We told him about the car and about me just getting home from deployment. He just stared at us for what felt like forever and told us that next time we break down, to do it somewhere else. He stood by his truck until we were out of sight. That was terrifying. I lived in the same house all my life, until I was 18 and went away for school. Jim has also lived next door for the entirety of me living at home. He lived with his mother. She died when he was about 60-something, and then he just lived alone, up until his death, which was about in his 70s. He dyed his hair red. He'd often wear t-shirts that you'd see on young boys, like Superman and the Flash. I guess his style of dress wasn't too out of the ordinary, but it just added to his odd character. Apparently, when one of my neighbors first moved in, who was a well-known lawyer in the area, Jim stopped him on the street and said, "Hey Aaron, aren't you afraid of someone just coming up to you and shooting you?" At this time, my neighbor hadn't met Jim and had no idea who he was, so he was extra weirded out and even feared for his safety. He did a background check on him after that and found nothing, so at least we knew that he had no history. Now comes the weird stuff I've experienced with Jim. He had terrible road rage. I was once driving, stopped at a light, and when it turned green for me, I started to go, and he did too, and should have been stopped. He almost hit me, so I slammed on my brakes and saw him jump out the car, not knowing who the driver was initially. I was shocked to find out it had been Jim, and he shook his fists and started screaming things like, "I'm gonna end you," in anger. I don't think he knew it was me, luckily, and I never brought it up to him later. I'm just glad that we didn't have a collision. My family once received a call from Jim that said, "I saw your light was on at 2 a.m. What were you doing up so late?" We're not close with Jim, as I'm sure you know by now, so to be asked was really not polite and quite stalkerish. Also, I'd often open my front door to find him just standing in the doorway, staring straight at my house. I guess he could just be looking outside observing passers-by, or birds or something. But come on. He was also obsessed with my dog, who he'd call his favorite girl. If I'd ever be walking out there and he'd see her, he'd stop and speak to her specifically, and act like I didn't exist. The worst thing he ever did, though, happened on Thanksgiving. This was when his mother was still alive, because she forced him to call us the day after to apologize. Thanksgiving night, Jim just so happened to be cleaning his loaded gun aimed out of his window, and he shot our house. My mum found the shell fragments or something like that on our porch. I would have liked to have heard his apology, or how he worded it even, but all I want to know is if he didn't want to willingly call us and was forced to do it by his mother. He never fixed his window that had the bullet hole. I remember seeing it years later. My bedroom is above the porch, so I just feel really lucky he hadn't somehow shot up into my room when I was asleep. After Jim passed, a few neighbors speculated he may have been autistic, which would make perfect sense with some sort of his mannerisms and the way he spoke, and why he never moved away from his mother's. But nonetheless, he did some creepy stuff during my time at my parents' house. We moved into a house, and everything was really quiet for the first 6 months or so. The neighbors told us that the people who lived there before had moved after their teenage son died in a motorcycle accident. Then after the first 6 months, my dad died, not in the house, and after that, stuff started to happen. I would have friends sleep over, and one night my friend woke me up because she said there was a young guy standing in my bathroom. So I went and checked, and there was nothing. Over the next few years, just about any friends that stayed over at night had said they saw a small, tall, blonde guy walking around the house. We did have a few other things happen, like a wine glass was on the counter and it broke with no one touching it. It just shattered on the counter. Another time during the winter, we had the heater on and my room was always the warmest in the house, and it was ice cold as you walked across my bedroom to the bathroom that was connected. The creepiest thing was when my boyfriend was sleeping on the couch in the middle of the night, and he said he woke up to a young guy pushing him off onto the floor. He said the guy didn't say anything, but my boyfriend at the time knew that he had to leave, and he did. He wouldn't stay at my place after that either. Just to go into further detail about the glass, my mum had a collection of glassware. She had so many that there weren't many places to put them anymore, so we just set them on the counter. The wine glass had been sitting there untouched for a long time. It hadn't just come out the dishwasher or anything like that. She just put it on the counter, and there it stayed. When it broke, no one was near, only me and my mum were there, and we were both 10 feet away at least. Could it have been something like a crack in the glass? Maybe. But at the time it startled us, and we thought it was bizarre. I had a dream a few weeks ago that my wife and I left our daughter with a caretaker overnight, who turned out to be a secret addict. We arrived to pick up our daughter, and the woman told us that she had blacked out and that our daughter must have wandered off. I took to the streets in blind, screaming panic to look for her. Civil order had broken down, of course, and there were people running everywhere in the streets. Total chaos. I have memories of horrific actions in this dream, and when I suddenly awoke, breathless and still panicked, my wife asks me what was wrong. I told her I'd just had a really unpleasant dream, but I didn't want to conjure the horror for the mother of our child. A few moments later, our daughter comes paddling down the hall and into our room. She asked me something she's never asked me before. "Daddy, how was your dream?" "Well, honey, I had a pretty bad dream, but it's over now," I said. Then she replied with, "It's okay, Daddy. I found a family. I had my lamb with me. I was safe." I was on a 5-hour flight, sitting next to a kid who was about 8 and his dad. The guy's wife and younger daughter were seated further up on the plane. The kid slept pretty much the entire flight, but as we were coming to land, he went nuts and was yelling all sorts of stuff about Harry Potter. His dad was desperately trying to calm him down, and he was like, "Hey, listen, very closely, and you can hear Mummy and Caroline talking up front. Can you hear Caroline?" The kid just straight up goes into a demon voice and is like, "No, Caroline is gone." The dad was mad and scolded him, but I had to turn away because I was losing myself in laughter. I used to be a first responder in my town and responded to one of the worst one-car accidents my town has ever seen. My town is very peaceful, but that does not stop unpeaceful people from coming through and sometimes causing an accident. Early one morning, we got a call for a single car accident on a road that people drive too fast on, far too often. It's sort of a main road. It's a main route, but rarely had lots of traffic, and it's a pretty heavily wooded area. In my area, roads going through woods usually means that road is super curvy. The driver was probably taking a turn too fast, didn't turn in time for the next one coming up, and hit a slope that turned his car over. That's what I thought before I saw the car. This thing was mangled. I had no idea a car could get so banged up all on its own. There was glass everywhere. Car juice, as I called it, sprayed around. I could definitely see where the car hit, but also looks like it ran into a lot of tree before setting where it is. We passed a tree that had damage just as we were pulling up to the accident. So, somehow, this guy not only hit a tree on a turn, but also continued to roll/tumble up the road and then upside down in the other lane facing the wrong direction. It was maybe 10 to 20 yards away from the first tree that we assumed he hit. When we arrived, there was another truck from the department on the scene, the rescue truck, and the jaws of life were already at work trying to pry this kid out. The EMS had stretchers standing by, but he needed to be airlifted to the hospital. Me and another firefighter went to a very conveniently located field to place markers for the Lifestar helicopter. They came within a few minutes, but were nervous to land in the area because it was very small. While the lieutenant was helping the Lifestar, I was beckoned to help the victim. This guy had no face. He was totally unrecognizable. He was covered in blood, swollen, cut up, chunks of skin missing, a mangled arm and leg. One of the firefighters I was with was looking really upset and confused. She looked like she was holding back tears, then looked angry, then looked determined, and would go through those phases in turn, and not always in that order. Usually I would ask, "Hey, what's wrong?" But not entirely appropriate when you're rescuing some kid who'll probably pass away in the helicopter. Turns out she was able to recognize the car, but wasn't able to recognize her friend. She was one of the first on the scene and was playing a primary role of getting him out, before the thought occurred that she might know him. After he was freed from the car and moved to the stretcher to be treated, she did recognize him. I could see it on her face. She, somehow, amazingly kept her cool. The EMTs cleaned up the kid's face and were getting ready to do any patchwork they could. The cleaner his face got, the easier it would be to identify him. I watched her face turn from her determined, "this is my job" look, slowly into a look of horror and anger, the "I don't want to be here right now" face. Her face squished up like she just ate a lemon. It looked like she was trying to keep all her tears and cries from escaping, then immediately went back to, "this is my job." By the time the Lifestar landed in the field, we had the kid strapped in and ready to go, and a little patched. We all hauled him up the tiny little tree-lined slope to get to the field, and he was loaded into the helicopter and left for the hospital. Then she lost it. She fell to the ground like her legs didn't work and screamed and sobbed. Only one of the guys knew exactly what was going on, but he didn't say anything. Another firefighter who was closer to her sat with her arm around her for comfort. But it didn't stop her wailing sobs and her talking helplessly to herself. Things like, "why did it have to be him?" and "goddamn, what an idiot," and blaming herself. Later in the week, we had a discussion about the accident and what was determined exactly to have caused it, the kid's status, and our review of how we handled it. That's also when we found out why she was so heartbroken about the kid. She stood in front of everybody and told us that he was a very close friend of hers from school, and she didn't even think about it being someone she knew until they started pulling him out of the car. She said she told herself it's no one she knew and to keep herself calm, but she definitely recognized him by the time the helicopter was ready to take him. She said she was pretty much holding her breath the entire time up until the copter came to keep herself from crying, and when he was gone could she finally let it out. She knew he might not make it, which was the most upsetting thing for her. The fact that she was directly involved in saving his life would weigh heavily as well, and no doubt she'd place blame on herself if he died. They determined the cause of the accident was him taking a turn too fast, slid sideways and hit the tree with the back fender of his car, which sent it spinning in the road, and, in the turn, hit the slight slope that was just steep enough to get his car to roll over a few times back onto the road. Our overall review was okay. Everything about the accident was handled as it should be. Sand was put down to absorb car juices. We cut the car open properly, moved all the large chunks out of the road so what little traffic came by could get past, and they handled the kid just fine too. Everything was done as correctly as it could be for what had happened, but the guy ended up passing anyway. He was the same age as the girl firefighter who helped rescue him, so 21 at the time. That's probably the worst single car accident I have ever seen. My town is small, very hilly and very swervy. It's easy to go way too fast on the roads here, especially if you don't live here and don't know all the turns, and when to slow down. It was predicted the kid was going over 80, which is insanely fast for the road he was on. When I heard that, I was surprised he didn't literally fly off the road and into the woods, and that any tree would have stopped him enough to just spin a few times. I couldn't believe it. 80 miles per hour. My car shakes off if I try to go that fast on a highway. It suddenly made all the damage to the car make sense. But anyway, there you go. Probably the worst non-fire related call I've ever been on. I should also mention this is the first heavy call I went on as a firefighter. Most things before this were burnt toast at the old folks' home, or being called to assist a town with a fire that they've already got under control. If it isn't obvious from this story, please drive safely. Remember, it's far better to be 1 minute late somewhere than your family to have to sit through a minute of silence. I have this neighbor that lives across the street from me. He doesn't live alone. He lives with his parents. Let's call him Drew. My parents tell me that Drew has mental issues, and when he acts crazy, I should stay away from him. I have a conversation with him, and he seems normal when he's on medication. One time, Drew stabs his grandfather to death when I was young. He was arrested at first, until his family told him that he had mental issues before he was arrested. The judge ordered Drew to be evaluated at the mental hospital until he's no longer a threat to himself and others. Drew moved back to his parents' house after that. I forgot to mention that he's off his medication. He would start to yell and sing at random times. Another time, things happened when I was 14 and in my room. To clarify, my window from my room shows his house, and I heard yelling from across the street. So I look out my window. It was him. He had a knife and was yelling gibberish to drivers trying to break in. Drew targeted people who drove on the road. Drivers swerved to get out the way and drove fast down the road, but they were all terrified. I was frozen in fear and didn't do anything about it except watch it go down. One driver contacted 911. The neighbor ran out the house when he heard the sirens, and Drew locked himself inside and refused anyone entry. Police and a SWAT team entered and told me to stay indoors until it was peaceful. The crazy neighbor stayed locked in for 8 hours until he gave himself up to the authorities. He was taken again to the mental hospital and again released back to his parents' house. The mother moved out because she was too frightened of him. She found his writings about him wanting to end her, and she divorced her husband after he refused to get him into a mental hospital. He didn't find any of the writing about him, so that's probably why. The last time was last year. Drew broke into his next-door neighbor's house, and he waited for them to come home. He had a machete with him. His mother saw him breaking into the house from the window and called the police. He was taken away. His father told my parents that he would be at the mental hospital for life. When my parents asked why, he refused to tell them. To Drew, please, be better. A few years ago, I was driving back to my house from a friend's house at 2 a.m. I was getting close to my house in a really rural area with cornfields on both sides of the road. All of a sudden, I saw stalks of corn blocking my path, going straight across the road from one field to another. Nobody was around, there were no cars, no houses, and just my headlights were shining on upright corn stalks standing across the road, as thick as the fields on either side. I knew I wasn't lost or anything. I drove home this way every day and stopped the car on the road and just staring at the cornstalks trying to figure out what the hell to do. After sitting there for a minute, I decided that staring at the corn waiting for something to happen was much scarier than doing something. So I hit the gas hoping the corn would just fall down in front of my small car. It was one of the strangest feelings driving through the corn. I imagine it is what it would feel like to run through platform 9 3/4 of Harry Potter. 1 second, I was staring at what seemed to be a solid cornfield, and the next, my car is easily knocking the stalks over as I was through. The rows of corn across the road weren't as deep as I had thought, and in no time I was on the other side, looking in the rearview mirror at the wall of corn with now a gaping hole in it. I went home, went to bed still freaked out. The next morning I went to leave, drove down the same road, and the only sign of the corn were a few stalks laying next to the road. I still Have no idea how that happened, but the corn was gone by morning. It must have been ghost corn. My sister has 3 kids. I don't have any, which means that I absolutely love being the auntie that spoils her nieces and nephews. Her newest addition is called Kaylee. She's 3 and is an absolute sweetheart. They recently moved into this bungalow in the middle of the woods. It is absolutely massive, and I do love their property. But one of the things that unnerves me is that the house has this eerie vibe. I felt that way for a while about it. Anyway, on to the story. I love Kaylee. She is such a sweetheart. But sometimes she comes out with the strangest things. I was once staying over babysitting the 3 kids while her and her husband had some quality time alone at the cinema. We were just hanging out, and out of nowhere, Kaylee waddles into the room. I ask her if everything's alright, and she points up to the very high ceiling and says, "The man's watching me." "What, Kaylee?" I look up, and there's no man. Remember how I said this is a bungalow? It's flat. There's no upstairs, just high ceilings. Did a balloon get up there? I look again, and there's nothing. "Kaylee, sweetheart, you're imagining things. There's nothing there." This is where the inner 3-year-old comes out, and she gets angry. "No, you're not looking, Auntie. He's right there." I look up again, and still can't see anything. Then she looks up, as if whatever she can see is talking to her, nods her head, and walks out. I ask Kaylee where she's going, and she just screams, she's got to find the rope. At this point, I was very concerned. I run after her and ask her where the hell she thinks she's going. She was going into her dad's workshop to look for some rope. When I ask her why, she says she doesn't know, but the man wants it and that he needs the rope now. I had just about had it at this point. I was very creeped out, and those 3 kids had an early bedtime for sure. I didn't babysit for a while, and the husband found the house far too eerie, and they moved out shortly after. This story was about my first time having mushrooms. I was sitting in a camp chair around a campfire with some other friends. We see this guy maybe 20 yards or so away, bent over looking closely at things and bumping around the tents. He had several flashing/glowing necklaces and braces, and was definitely looking the part of having ingested something dubious, but was maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. He makes his way over to our circle when we ask what he's doing poking around the tents. Maybe he's lost. Certainly wasn't right-minded at the time. He sits on the ground right next to me in my chair and starts going on about how messed up he is, and we just don't understand. Everyone is silently watching and listening to him ramble on. When he turns and looks directly at me, maintains eye contact when he says, "We don't understand," and he removes his eye. His eyeball. He takes that out. That was it for me. I got up and sped walked back to my tent, zipped it out and noped right out of there, wondering just how that happened, and was sure it would give me nightmare for weeks to come. A few minutes later, one of my friends opens the tent and comes in, and tells me that after everyone about crapped themselves, they found out he had an artificial eye. I'm assuming after someone probably tried to help after what they thought was an emergency of a guy tearing his own eye. Anyway, not a big thing. But to witness something like that after being on hallucinogenics for the first time was incredibly intense. This happened to me when I was about 5. I don't actually remember it, but it's what my mum told me, and she isn't the kind of person to lie about things, especially when she's only telling them to me and has no one to impress. So, I'm gonna take it as truth. Allegedly, when I was 3, I would walk around the house naked. This started out of nowhere, and when asked by my mother why I was doing this, I would apparently always reply, "Because that's how the lady does it." My mum didn't really understand, but kind of brushed it off. There were a few times when I'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Apparently, I'd say that the lady had come to pay a visit. My mother tried ruling it out as just a night terrors and me fixating on an imaginary character, and thought nothing more of it. It wasn't until a few years later, with these events still persisting, that a neighbour from the area got friendly with my mum. They came round, and out of nowhere the conversation turned to this house's history, as of course my mother was quite interested, having lived in here a few years. The neighbour told her a story, that there was a woman before that lived in this house about 30 years ago. Allegedly, she committed arson in several places around town, and when she thought she was being found out, she burnt herself alive in the garden. However, while she was on fire, she realized it was a bad idea and ran into the house, smacked things over her face and eyes to try and put the flame out, and blinded herself. She managed to get the fires out, but she was blind. The burns were so gnarly though that she ended up dying a few days later in hospital because of complications. Funny thing is, they never found out it was her. It was all in her mind, that she thought that they were finding her out. The house was put up for sale, and the lady said that it had been sold countless times, but people had never stayed here as long as we had, and she found it incredibly fascinating and didn't know why they left, that maybe it left a dark aura. That's when it all clicked with my mum. My mum then summoned me into the room. "Hayley, honey, come here." I entered. "Tell me about that lady that you used to see." "The lady who has the black eyes and face?" "Yeah, that one. What does she look like?" "Her whole body is black, and she smells funny." That is all I said, until I wandered away. My mum and the woman were left absolutely stunned. It all added up. Was I seeing the ghost of this dead lady? I used to work in a trailer park for my parents. Quite often, people would start using methamphetamine, begin to fall behind on rent, and get evicted. Whenever we evicted someone, their trailer was usually too torn to do anything useful with it. Essentially, to prevent having just a trailer in the middle of the park that we couldn't use, we'd buy it from them and just tear it down. Anyway, the scary and creepy part is here. Many of these occupants had children. More than half of all these children's rooms I found had locks on the doors from the outside. Inside the children's room, it was quite evident that the kids would sometimes be locked inside for days at a time, due to the bathroom corners that would sometimes appear. The doors on the insides of the rooms typically had scratch marks along the edges of the door and the frame. Getting rid of all the stuff inside before beginning demolition always frightened me. I was always afraid that I'd end up finding some child in a terrible condition amongst the filth. It never happened, but the odds of it potentially happening were, in my opinion, quite high. If ghosts are real, I grew up with one in my house. It would regularly torture my dog, in that she would frequently yelp and cry in the other room, and hightail it the hell out of there before anything shifty would happen in mine. For clarity, my mother worked night shift, and I was the only one home. While there was always stuff a bit off, like TVs turning off, the volume changing by itself, and sounds of things falling in the kitchen, but then nothing being down there when you check it out. The one thing that still gets me is when I saw a metal candlestick holder sitting on my side drawer fly from one side of the drawer to the other, hard enough to make a noise as it slammed against the side. My second drawer was hanging open, and it flew from right to left. I still can't wrap my mind around it. It's been a very long time since anything strange has happened, and the more time that passes, the more I feel further removed from it, having been a reality. It absolutely happened though. I rarely talk about it though, because it can't be explained, and tends to make me feel uneasy, and that I lose credibility with others. My mum told me something I said as a 3-year-old. I don't remember this, but my mum told me that when I turned 3 years old, I told her that I was originally a boy, and that I was hit by a train, and came back as a girl. This came out of nowhere, and I was so nonchalant about it. My mum said, "Jamie, you were never a boy, you're a little girl." My response was, "Yeah, I know, I'm a girl now." I only told her this once, and never brought it up again. My mum didn't really push or ask any specific questions because she was so creeped out, which I don't blame her for. But I wish I could have given more details about it, like what was the boy's name? I tried looking up any details about a boy being hit by a train in my area, but as of yet, haven't found anything. This happened when I was around 7 or 8 years old, but I remember it very clearly. Just some background. Our family is religious and are Catholic. I was playing Jenga with my siblings and cousins. It was getting really late, maybe 12 AM to 1 AM. My mum didn't know that we were still up and playing, but when she woke up in the middle of the night and told us to go to sleep, we said that we weren't sleepy. To that she replied, "El diablo va a aparecer." In other words, the devil is going to appear. She was trying to scare us to put it away, but of course we didn't listen. Now my mum has always told us that ghosts are real and that she believes highly in them but is not afraid. She has told us countless stories of her experiences. Anyway, I don't know, but all stopped playing because we heard something. We all listened, and sure enough, the sound was easy to make out. The distinct sound of chains dragging a horse walking. This was right outside our home. It was like whatever the hell it was wanted us to know that it was outside, because it went on for at least 45 seconds. Now keep in mind that we didn't live in an area where you can hear horses. We lived 2 blocks away from a major freeway in Los Angeles. Now I'm not crazy and I'm not imagining this because everyone that lived in my house heard it. Sure enough, my mum comes out and says, "I told you so." Sure enough, none of us were able to sleep that night. Luckily I was young, so sleeping with my parents was acceptable, but my sister was inconsolable. I always enjoy sharing this scary story because it's so weird. When I was 6 to 8, I would always have nightmares of a little boy sitting on the edge of my bed crying, asking me if I knew where his mother was. Obviously, being a kid with no brains, I tried to console him, but it never worked. Fast forward 3 years, my brother is around the same age, and he starts having the dream/nightmare/visit from Satan incarnate. Same boy, same foot of the bed, and crying. My mum chalks it up as imaginary friends. Me telling him what happened, and he wants it to happen to be like his big brother. Again, 3 years later, fast forward to my baby cousin, now roughly 6 or 7. He's sleeping over with my little brother. After playing video games and trading Pokemon cards all night, they decide to hit the hay. My little brother is sleeping in my room, and my cousin in my little brother's room, all to himself. My cousin wakes up in the morning and asks us if we saw the little kid crying for his mother. I grew up around my grandmother in her century-old farmhouse in deep South Texas. She was the oldest daughter to Hungarian immigrant parents. I remember being told by very serious adults that she was different. She'd use playing cards and tell people's fortunes, but she'd be very specific, like that you'd be in a car accident because the red truck in front of you had its rear left tire blown out and you'll break your arm. I was also told that they would call her to tell her about something, and she'd know about it already, even though there was no possible way. In the middle of this, 3 sets of bones were discovered on the property, identified as migrants and several decades old. That's when things got weird. Faces started appearing in reflections on glass, even though no one was there to cast them. Things would move around in the kitchen and bathroom. Sounds of walking would be heard when everyone was sitting. Howling winds could be heard when the night was without a breeze. What haunted me into adulthood was the closet. The fan control was in the closet, and I'd often leave it open on my way to the bed. One night I was having trouble sleeping, but my attention became locked on the closet. That's when someone walked out, around the foot of the bed, and out the far door into the music room. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I have never been so scared before or since. I got up, closed both doors, and kept all doors closed around me as I sleep, even now. I told my grandmother what happened, who called a Catholic priest who she knew. The 2 of them performed an exorcism, and things improved. But I can't fathom what happened. I know she was a special woman. I know what happened has no explanation, and I keep trying to tell myself that I'll be happier sticking my head in the sand. I live in Germany, in a pretty small village. I think there are about 2,500 people living here. The next bigger cities are both 15 kilometers away, although they can be reached by bus fairly easily. Me and my friend Andrew were usually hanging around in the village until morning dawn on weekends. We'd grab our guitars and sit on the parking lot of the small grocery store or on the schoolyard of the middle school. Both are a few dozen meters away from the next building, so we're able to jam without annoying anybody. One night we sat there, cracked some beers, and were in a pretty good mood, writing our songs and singing some covers. You know how it is, teenagers right before their 20s. It was around 2 or 3 in the middle of the night, when we noticed a silhouette walking towards us from the main street. Our eyes have adapted to the dark, and we were seeing a young man, not saying anything to us, but instead moving pretty fast. He was wearing all dark clothes, a dark hoodie, and a dark backpack. I think he didn't see us, since the main street has bright street lights and we were sitting in the dark, but he sure as hell did hear us. Me and Andrew looked at each other, a bit confused, as he seemed altered. The guy stopped about 2 meters before reaching us and said, "Hey guys, mind if I sit with you for a while?" He seemed shady. My body told me not to trust this guy. It honestly told me to book it. But I didn't. Instead, he was engaging in our conversation, talking about music for a few minutes. He then said something strange. "Man, it feels good to talk to actual people again. Are you guys German?" I told him I was half Russian. Andrew is German. He told us he was from Arabia. He moved to Germany with his parents. He proceeds to tell us all about him. You know, the police is after me, they want to put me in jail. I looked at Andrew and he looked at me. I wasn't sure if this guy was lying about it, but he had proof. Damn, he had some good proof for that. "Look," he said, and opened his bag, pulling a transparent bag out of it. It had enough green for a college party of 50 people, maybe more. We thought he would start to offer it. Instead, he pulled out another bag with some white/yellowish stuff in it. Not too much. "This one was full. Once," he said. "I was supposed to sell it. Instead, I started taking it myself. And now, people had found out. The police, the guys I owe money to. I haven't talked to people for days, and I'm thirsty and high all the time. Look, guys." He pulled out a handgun. "Maybe I should end it right here. I've nowhere to go." I was shaking on the inside, but I was afraid to show fear. I did not know what this guy was up to. Was he seriously that high? He looked at us, laughed, well, more like exhaled through his nose, and packed his things away. "This would be wrong," he said. I can't really remember much from that point. I remember him walking away after, and wanting to shake hands with us. He thanked us for talking to him, and strolled away into the woods. My assumption, to the next village about 3 kilometers away. We waited for him to walk a good distance, and decided to get home as quickly as we could without drawing any attention. He said something like, "You wouldn't rat me out, right?" So we tried to make it look like we stayed there. We were afraid he would follow us otherwise. All the way home, we checked behind us to see whether he were following or not. He wasn't. We made it out of this, and I did not report him to the police, and my friend did neither. We were just too scared. We told him our names out of fear, which was a stupid thing to do, and we were afraid he could trace us back. We do hope, however, to never meet him again. So first, a little background. I'm a 25-year-old mother of 2 wonderful kids, a boy who's 5, a girl who's 2, and a very smart stepson who's 8. It's mainly about my son, the 5-year-old CJ, and my stepson Liam. Just so you know a little bit about CJ, he's a very hyper and imaginative boy. He's not great with books or writing and has a speech delay, but very great with motor skills and figuring things out. Now, since CJ was a baby, he's done some odd things, to which I have never looked much into. The first thing was night terrors as a baby. I guess they're common, but my mother, husband and I found them weird, because what could a baby be afraid of? He would scream in his sleep, but wake up and be just fine. Now fast forward to when he was 2. He would use toy guns and clear rooms in a way police or military would. I never thought much about it, but my husband, being ex-military and now law enforcement, would watch him and notice how he would do it so accurately that it was puzzling. Then, when he was about 3 or 4, he would complain about the monsters during the day and at night. Common things I knew, but he would point to empty closets or corners of rooms and say, "Scary," or "Monster," or "Scary hand get me," or "He's dark." Even once when he was 4, he grabbed a Bible and went through the closet and say, "We need to exercise." But again, I guess a common thing kids have because of the big imaginations. Now fast forward to a few days ago. My husband and the kids and I are driving to Walmart to get things for our daughter's 2nd birthday. When we pass an ambulance, then out of the blue CJ says, Grandma's dead, which puzzled us, and we asked him what he said. He repeated, Grandma's dead. So we asked, Grandma B or Grandma K? No, Liam's grandma, he says. So we laughed, and Liam says, your grandma is my grandma, and we just laughed the whole thing off. Then about 30 minutes later, Liam's mum calls him and tells him, your stepdad's grandma died. To which he was sad, and we tended to him. It wasn't until maybe an hour or so later I turned to my husband and say, oh my god, CJ predicted that. To which we were freaked out a bit. I don't know maybe if it's a coincidence. Kids say odd things, but it's hard to deny the odd things that seem to happen around my son. My wife and I travelled to South Africa a few months ago and spent some time in Kruger National Park. The first night we stayed at one of the less developed camps, which was definitely cooler than the more built up ones that felt like smaller cities, called Biamiti. It was around 9:30 or so, and we had just returned from a guided sunset drive. I was with the wife out on the patio, drinking a glass of wine and enjoying the sounds of nature, when my body told me that I was ready to rid myself of that wonderful airplane food I had eaten earlier. The cottage that we were staying at had a living room, bedroom and bathroom. The bathroom had 2 doors and was accessible from either room. The door going into the bedroom must have been a bit warped because it didn't really play nice when you closed it. Knowing that I was about to unleash some hell, I made damn sure that the door was completely closed and the latch engaged. So there I am, sitting atop my porcelain throne, with cell phone in hand playing some forgettable game while I did my business. As I finish part 1 of this 2-step, I see the bedroom door handle moving down, and the door swings open about 4 inches. Now I have a history of turning bathrooms into a disaster zone, so my wife knows to stay far away while I'm on the can. Hello? I mutter vulnerably. It's hard to feel like a badass when you're on the cam with your shorts around your ankles. There's no response. So the wife must be messing with me. She has to be. I saw the handle move downwards. At this point, the goosebumps have kicked in, and my heart starts beating like a bass drum. I hastily make with the toilet paper and head back to the patio. Why did you open the door while I was pooping? My wife replies, what are you talking about? Are you kidding me? No, that's the last place I'd want to be. You're really not kidding with me? No. I sit down with some more wine, still wondering what actually happened, and could not come up with a reasonable explanation. Needless to say, we slept with a light on in the living room, like a couple of children, in case Ghosty decided to come back. I need to give you a bit of context. I live on the ground floor of my building, alone, in a small apartment. I'm a male, standing at 5'11". I've lived here for the past 5 months. When I moved in, I had 2 neighbors on my floor, a single mother with 2 children directly next to my apartment, and an Asian woman in her 50s. The Asian woman was a bit creepy, as she was peeking through her door when I visited the apartment. Then, when I brought my belongings inside for a second time, then never saw her again. In the middle of October, the single mother and her 2 children kind of disappeared. I never saw them again and assumed that they had simply moved out. The other apartment, however, had its doors and windows closed. Around that time, I started to notice the corridor had the smell of the green stuff almost every morning. Note that this is still the case up to today. I have no problem with that, as I really don't care so long as my apartment doesn't smell. 2 weeks ago, problems started to occur. One morning I heard 2 men speaking there and laughing in the other apartment. It was the first time I'd heard someone living there, so I was in a bit of shock, and I just told myself, he just found a mate to smoke with, and didn't think too much about it. However, since that, it's been 3 times, and these 2 guys, when they arrive to their apartment, go and look around every door in the corridor. Since there are only 3, they're very loud, and it's easy to know when they're near mine. They always stay a few minutes then leave, but the last time was the scariest. I was chilling, playing on my Wii as I had nothing else to do with my evening. It was around 7 PM. Then suddenly I hear them coming in the corridor. I was starting to get used to it, but I always locked my door, so I thought nothing of it. Then suddenly, someone started hitting my door almost like they were punching them, then started to grab the doorknob and shake it about. Then they left. When the banging started, I panicked. I threw my Wiimote to grab the nearest knife in the kitchen and froze, asking myself what to do. I waited a few minutes after they left to check if my doors were fully locked, and I was relieved that I always lock them. I never leave the doors unlocked even if I'm in. I genuinely don't know what to do, since there's technically no evidence and I'm fine, but I'd rather never meet them again. My friend's daughter is pretty messed up. She's 7 and she is very much into horror movies. I think it's fair to say I don't like the child. I tolerate her. I regularly foster kittens, and last summer I fostered 2 litters. I invited them over to check out the kittens, who were not a month old. My friend's daughter promptly exclaims upon seeing them, "Kittens, how cute!" smiling wide with the typical flair and enthusiasm you would expect from a 7-year-old girl. She immediately scoops one by the neck, turns to me and says, "May I kill it?" grinning like the Joker just got to shoot Batman's parents. I promptly asked them to leave. I have reactive attachment disorder, and as a result I struggle with severe depression. However, I don't want to take any medication. I say that because I was going through one of the worst bouts of depression I've had in about 1.5 years, and I wasn't hallucinating because of medication. It was Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, October 13th to 14th. I'd cried myself to sleep like I had for however many hours before. When I woke up, it was 3:34. My cat Betty was walking around on the bed, and for some reason the alarm on my phone was going off. I use the Sleep Cycle app, and it was going off although the alarm wasn't set until 5:30 to 6. So I'm frustrated that it's decided to stop working correctly. Then I hear that my computer in the living room turns on. I thought my other cat, Vader, must have knocked the mouse walking over the desk. Then I see the light turn on from the monitor. What? I thought. I was kind of pissed, so I started grumbling. Damn cats, Betty stomping all around and Vader turning stuff on. Until I turned on the bedside lamp. Both cats are laying at the end of my bed, looking into the living room. I froze. I was so confused. I was trying to make sense of it when I heard my front door open, like this screen door first, and then the front doorknob, and then I heard it move across the carpet. Unlike the movies, I jumped out of bed as quietly as possible, wondering how the hell someone was coming into our apartment, as I was sure I'd locked the door. I silently stepped into the hall and peeked around the corner. My cats nonchalantly decided it was time to ignore the obvious murderer entering our home. I peek around the corner, and the door is closed. The lights are off, the monitor is off, but I can hear the computer running. I stood there for who knows how long. I still can't make sense of it. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. It wasn't a dream. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I don't know. But I've never been afraid in my apartment, and at that moment I felt very afraid, and very much not alone. It hasn't happened again. I just don't know. I'm sharing this because I have to get it off my chest, and I just drunk enough to not care about what my former bosses would say about me disclosing incident reports or anything remotely similar. I suppose an introduction is in order. My name is Randy Hamilton. I've been an EMT for almost a decade. Well, I guess it would be more accurate to say I was an EMT. Me and my former employers had what you would call a conflict of interest, and I turned in my resignation about 3 days ago. Really, it was just a formality. They would have fired me if I hadn't. For the past 30-odd years, I've lived in the little town of McDermott, Ohio. Beautiful little slice of Appalachia. As long as you can overlook the fact that it's located in the heart of the heroin epidemic sweeping the Midwest. Hell, Scioto County was leading the state in heroin OD cases last time I checked. And from my time in the department, I can verify that statement. So you're probably wondering what got me so eaten up that I had to down a half bottle of whiskey to open up about it. Well, pull up a seat and get comfortable, because you're going to be here a while. I joined the department in 2007, fresh out of school, and went through courses to get certified as an RN. But then I realized working in an office really wasn't my style. Turns out stabilizing trauma victims in the back of a speeding vehicle was. I had to take a couple of more classes, but they were cake compared to what I'd already done, and I was pretty sure I had found my calling. Pretty sure is the key word there. You never forget your first run. The feeling's comparable to when you lose your virginity, except it's typically not as pleasant of an experience. Mine? Car wreck. 18-wheeler hit a red 2005 Chevy Cobalt. Well, nicked it more like. Semi was absolutely fine, barely a scratch on it. The Chevy? Not so much. Girl behind the wheel swerved and hit the guardrail. Flipped the car too. We got there about 3 minutes after the call went out, and we, being me and my partner for that shift, Michael. Mike was and still is a great guy. A little morbid at times, but in our line of work, you just pick that up. He'd been on for 4 years before I joined, and had some pretty messed up stories of his own. As we were making our way to what was left of the Cobalt, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Laying off on the side of the road, about 50 feet out from where the Cobalt came to rest, was the driver. Even from so far away, I could tell she wasn't going to make it. Her lower jaw was an absolute mangled wreck, and I could see the white glint of bone sticking out of her forearm. Compound fracture for sure. Jesus Christ, I said, absolutely shocked at what I was seeing. How the hell did she? That's why you wear a seatbelt, rookie. Last thing you want to do is go face first through a windshield doing 60. Mike's words hit even harder when we got closer, and saw that this girl was still alive. I doubt any of you have any idea of what sort of horrific sounds came out of the mouth of a human being who has what basically amounts to little more than minced hamburger meat for a jaw. Pained, wet gurgling, mixed with involuntary exhalation, not so dissimilar from an asthmatic wheeze. That's what I heard that came out of her mouth. Within seconds, we had her on a stretcher, going with another ambulance. Sometimes I like to think she made a miraculous recovery, and I just haven't got the memo. I'm not that stupid though. With injuries like that, she'd had to have been fed through a straw for the rest of her short and agonizing life. That wasn't what got me that night. What did get me was when we checked out the Cobalt proper. There was a massive streak of blood mixed with bits of brain matter and skull fragments, which started where the car had flipped on its side and ended at the rear left of the passenger window. Almost immediately, I thought the worst and took a closer look. That's when I heard the crying. Turns out, the girl driving was a babysitter, and she had 2 little girls in the back seat, and only one open seat. Irresponsible jackass had stacked the kids on top of each other and had them sharing a seatbelt. A reckless driver improperly secured children and an open window. Recipe for disaster. We had to cut in through the roof of the car to get the girls, and when I looked through that hole, something in me died. The surviving girl had her sister's decapitated corpse laying on her lap and was holding onto the body like her life depended on it. When she looked up at me through the hole, with a level of sorrow no girl her age should be able to comprehend, let alone experience, I broke. I pulled her out of that wreck and hugged her with tears in my eyes and told her it was all going to be okay, that we were going to get her home as soon as we got her checked out. While I carried her to the ambulance, Mike was confirming that the other child was dead. That's when the girl in my arms said something that still haunts me to this very day. "Why are you leaving Veronica? Why are you leaving my sister? She's hurt. Please, can't you help her, mister?" I still have nightmares to this day about that night, about that little girl and her sister, and I just don't know how much longer I can deal with it. That's enough for tonight. The whiskey's wearing off. I don't feel like going back to that night any more than I have to. Veronica and Abigail. Those were their names. I'm sorry I couldn't help her, Abby. I'm so sorry. I was about 2, and all I said was random stuff. One day I was twisting my ear, as I have pretty flexible ears, so I can twist them a lot without hurting them. And my mother asked me why I was doing that, because her father had a habit of doing that too. My answer to that question was, because I'm your father. Now it might not seem so creepy after all, but my grandfather died a long time before I was born, so in no way could I have picked that up from him. Needless to say, she was kind of freaked out. I worked for a title company that required me to travel to people's homes and execute loan transfers from one bank to another. Most of the time, the homes were within a 50-mile radius of the office, but on rare occasions it did require me to travel further. This is the time I met someone/something I can't comprehend. I am a completely sane individual, and I like to think that I have a good grip on reality. This closing I was driving to was in eastern Ohio, maybe 30 miles from the Pennsylvania border, and it was in the middle of nowhere. This was over 10 years ago, before smartphones and Google Maps were a thing, where I needed to rely on printed directions via MapQuest. For this closing, MapQuest gave me directions, but a vague idea to where the actual home was located. In situations like this, I would typically get as close as possible, stop at a gas station and ask for directions, and then continue. However, this time I couldn't find a gas station, market, library, nothing. This was during the middle of the day in late summer, and I was in no rush, so I took my time. Going through this hilly valley, a very beautiful part of Ohio, looking for a certain intersection. I made a handful of passes throughout this town, but no luck, and turned around once again. When I was making my return, I spotted an old bearded man on the side of the road, sitting on a rock minding his own business. It was just him and I who were on the road. I pulled over, rolled my window down and asked him for help. He smiled, never getting up off his rock that he was resting on, looked at me in the eyes and gave me instructions and pointed where to go with his cane. Except he spoke to me in some language. I can't place it. It wasn't Spanish, German, French, or Slavic languages. It was like tongues. I just nodded, said thanks, and pretended like I understood. Eventually, I made it to the next town and found my way. I wasn't spooked, but later, at the closing, when I shared this story with the client, I was informed I possibly met this elusive figure that had been spotted in the surrounding area. He's been known to wave to people and then disappear, but no one has ever spoken to him before me. How lucky. I am a 27-year-old female. At the time this occurred, I was a senior in high school, angsty and steady into partying. For this story, I need to let you know about someone called Kay. Kay almost cost me my life, and I never want to see her again. She'd grown up privileged, given anything she ever wanted. Her parents adopted her 5 cousins, and this is when she started to rebel. Her parents, well off, started to pay less attention to her, so Kay had all the freedom in the world. At this time, this incident occurred. Kay was 18, and I had just turned 18. We were headed to a kickback at these guys' house, and it was nothing more than a little bit of the green stuff. Now, I've done my share in smoking it, popped a few pills here and there, and I had just casually tried ecstasy the summer prior. However, I was planning on staying sober. She picked me up, we stopped to buy cigs at a gas station, and bought a fountain drink, one with the straw and everything. This is crucial for this story later. We arrived at the apartment, and everyone is smoking, including Kay, but I declined. She would always say stuff about me, how she never wanted to be high alone, complaining about how I never got as high as her, so I obliged, and I cleared the bong. Off her hit, not even taking a full hit. She asked for a drink of my soda, so I handed it to her. We had it for a good minute. I had my head turned, talking to someone at the kickback, and when I looked back at Kay, she was messing with my straw. I didn't think much of it, as she handed it back to me. Within 30 or so minutes, I started to feel intensely high, to the point that I needed to escape from the group. I go out front to smoke a cigarette, only to find that I couldn't stand, so I laid on the front porch. Then all of these dark thoughts flashed through my mind. I felt so sick, like my stomach was being torn open. I couldn't stand. I had to crawl to the bushes to throw up. I thought to myself, all of this from clearing a bomb? So I laid back on the porch. The apartment was located on a busy street in the city. I also thought about running into traffic because I felt like I was dying. So I gave myself 2 options. I could run into traffic, have a car hit me, and end this horrible pain I was in. Or I could get some help, maybe flag someone down. My mind wasn't in the right state. I knew nobody at the kickback would take me seriously, and I knew something was horribly wrong. I thought about calling my mum. I must have dialed her number and hung up about 5 times. Finally, I called her and told her what happened. After that, I didn't know why I was so high. Nobody else was feeling the way I felt. What seemed like an eternity later, Kay came out looking for me. As I'm puking my guts into the bushes, she asks me if I want to get some food. I asked her if she was serious, as she laughed as I puked. What I didn't know is that my mother had called my older brother to collect me, since he lives close to where I was. He showed up with a machete, ran inside and threatened people. He didn't know who gave me what. It wasn't until I got home that my brother took one last look at my eyes and noticed how dilated my pupils were, so they rushed me to the ER. After more puking, my memory goes a bit fuzzy. I just remember asking my sister-in-law if I was going to die, and telling her that I was afraid. They ended up sedating me due to the fact that I was yelling and threatening the nurses, which is extremely out of character for me. They did a tox screen and found MDMA, along with a host of other things in my system. I'm assuming the other stuff were the ones used to make up the ecstasy. Now, this is all frightening and everything. However, what I found out a few days later shocked me to my core. Kay had been to a house party the next night. Somebody there had said she was passing out free E to 4 different people. Of those 4 people, 3 had grand mal seizures and had to be taken to the ER by ambulance. I'm assuming whatever she was giving out was a bad bunch. Remember when she asked me to have a drink of my soda? I'm assuming this is when she dropped the pill inside and it dissolved. She probably crushed it beforehand or something. I have no clue. But at this time in my life I hadn't done anything for quite a while, especially not that. Kay also went on to tell people that I was the one that slipped her the stuff, and she had to go to the hospital. She's a pathological liar and has to go to therapy for a long time for mental disorders. All of this happened because she wanted me to be high like her. I could have ended my own life because I wasn't in the right frame of mind, and this still affects me to this day. It sounds cliché, but I have a hard time trusting people. With this experience and among other things. I also don't like sharing drinks with friends. I get scared when I go out to a bar or club, fearing for the worst. I mean, if my own friend had done this to me, what's stopping a stranger? So I always guard my drink no matter what. And Kay, let's never meet again. I was a counsellor at a summer camp for inner city kids. Because we had the youngest group, and because of the culture shock, as camp was in a rural area, we had 4 counsellors for every bunk of about 20 kids. One night at around midnight, we were all playing poker while the kids were sleeping, and then one of the kids, Brian, pops up and starts whimpering. We go over and ask what's wrong, assuming that Brian had a nightmare, when he points at the far corner of the bunk and says, "There are little people there." We asked him what he meant, but all we got out of him was that there were little people and that they were watching us. He was so insistent on the point that we trained our flashlights onto the corner to prove to him that he was imagining things. Brian shouted, "There they are! They're moving up the light!" and he ducked his head under the covers. He went back to sleep in the same position a minute later. I guess he was so tired. Even fear couldn't prevent him from sleeping. We were all unnerved, especially our counsellor Damon, who had his bed nearest the corner, who basically said, "Well, now I don't want to sleep." My friend Chad said, "This is like one of those horror movies where the adults don't believe the kids, and then they all meet a very sticky end." Brian did this next night, but then he stopped and calmed down for the rest of the summer. As far as I know, no little people showed up. A year ago, my family moved into our new house that we're renting. I've had 2 odd experiences in 2 different rooms, one being very recent, the first being late winter. The first experience was very short, but freaky. I had wandered into my room and flopped onto my bed. I began playing with my tablet when I heard this horrendous noise. Something had dragged, something across the outer wall of my room. It sounded like a person taking a bone or nails and running it along the outer wall of my room. I ran over to my window and threw open the blinds, but nothing was there. My room at the time, since I switched recently, had no brush, trees or anything pressed against the house. What makes it scarier is that outside my room is a large tank that blocks part of the outer wall of my room. Something had somehow avoided that getting in the way. My second story happened a few days ago. I was home alone with my younger brother. We live in California and earthquakes are very frequent. I have a huge fear of them, which will explain my reaction. I was in my room lying in bed. I was awake checking my phone and was just too lazy to get up. My younger was playing Xbox in the living room, and I threw open YouTube and suddenly I'm nearly thrown off my bed. It was like an earthquake. My bed shook violently for a split second and nothing else in my room moved. But I didn't care at the time. I sprung up and ran to grab my brother when I noticed he was perfectly fine. He even looked at me like I was being weird, so I walked around the house and noticed nothing had changed. I was still so shaken up, I had to message a friend to get her to calm me down. I don't even know what happened. My mum is normally a pretty grounded person. She wouldn't believe in ghosts, however something happened involving me that really made her question her belief. When I was 3, my grandfather, Mom's dad, died. As a result, my mum and I moved into my grandma's house since she couldn't live alone. Now here's the thing, I never met my grandfather. I've never been to my grandma's house before either. Despite this, I knew things about my grandfather that I couldn't have known. For example, I started staring out the front window. When asked why, I said I was waiting for Grandpa. When my mum asked me how I knew when Grandpa would be back, I described his car, and by the time I'd moved in, his car was long gone. I never saw it, and it's not in any pictures either. I also sometimes would prevent my mum or grandma from sitting somewhere, saying that Grandpa was sitting there. He also had a favourite spot to sit in that I wouldn't let anyone sit in. Again, there's no way I could have known this. So this goes on for some time, and then my mum decides that she's going to try and communicate with her dad one night while alone. Basically saying she doesn't want him to talk to her through me. I guess it worked, because my episodes about my grandfather stopped after that. I grew up in a small town in Maryland, right on the borders of Pennsylvania and Delaware. We moved into our neighborhood in 1974, and I was an infant. The builders had 3 styles you could choose from, and one being a pretty unique design. I always wished my parents would have picked that one. There is only one other neighborhood I know that must have been built by the same people. Across the border in Delaware, I've lived all over, and I've also had jobs as a cable installer, so I'm pretty familiar with most neighborhoods in the area and design and layout. Back in the early 60s, there was a plane crash that would have been a 10-minute walk from my house. Over 80 people passed during the incident. Pan Am Flight 214. Ghost stories and sightings were all part of my childhood, but not really related to what happened to me. My family moved to Virginia in 1991, and with the exception of one childhood friend, I had no ties with the area after that. I joined the military, and then I took a job out in Utah. After some strange life happenings, I had the opportunity to move my wife and young son back to this same small town. It was a great place to grow up. Well, it was back in the 80s, but there are so many problems there now. We didn't move to the same neighborhood, but rented an apartment not too far away, a couple of miles at most from my childhood home. My wife worked the midnight shift, and often my son would sleep in our bed when she was at work. He was around 5 at the time. It was somewhere around 11 p.m, and my son was in there fast asleep. I went in, and had just pulled him in close. I just love cuddling him. I really miss those times. I hadn't even turned on the TV yet. I'm one of those weirdos who has to have it on to fall asleep. I had just gotten underneath the covers. And as a kid, everyone called me Kenny. But everyone since high school called me Ken. Well, just as I was about to grab the remote, and turn on the TV. I hear my name whispered. Kenny. I laid perfectly still for a few more minutes listening. I didn't even want to breathe. Did my wife come home? Beside her, very few people call me Kenny, and nobody within 1,500 miles. Maybe there are people outside and I could hear them. Did I leave the TV on in the living room? Birds? Upstairs neighbors? I finally relaxed. I mean, what could it be? Then it happened again. Kenny. This time a more forceful whisper, possibly agitated, possibly trying to get my attention but not wanting to wake up my son. The worst part? As it said my name, the hairs on the back of my head parted with its breath. Both my parents passed away in '97 in unrelated events. They never met their grandchildren, and I often wonder if my mother came to visit. I can't be 100% sure, but it sounded feminine, although very raspy. I've never been so afraid. I just knew if I rolled over, somebody would have been there. I must have laid there for hours before drifting off finally. I didn't tell a soul about this. Not my wife, not my best friend. Nobody. About 2 weeks go by and I had trained this guy at work. He became a pretty good friend at the time, and we learned we had extremely similar backstories. He grew up in the same house style I did in Delaware, and we also went to the same very small private school. People who grew up in the area don't even know it's there. There were only 13 other kids in my 8th grade class. Same car growing up, parents had similar backstories. It was a bit uncanny but nothing too crazy. Well, one night, we were hanging out and he said something to the effect of, "Please don't make fun of me, but I have something to tell you," and proceeded to tell me an almost identical tale of what happened to him. I'd never told anyone, and we have no idea if they are related, but he said he was laying in bed at 1 a.m. and someone whispered his name twice. He got up, looked around, had a smoke, and decided to just stay up for the rest of the night. Not sure what that means, or if the two events were related, but it really freaked us out. There was this kid in my high school a couple of years ago, and I followed him on Instagram just because me and my friends thought he was hilarious and weird. He was awkward and hardly spoke with anyone. But anyway, he posted a picture of himself holding a BB replica and saying, "It's time to go to school." He got expelled because of that, but I was freaking out because I thought it was real, but we found out later it was only a BB. I had just turned 21, and obviously wanted to celebrate by going to the most popular dance club in my town with a few girlfriends. I'd never had a fake ID or anything, so this was my first clubbing experience. We get inside and order drinks. I ordered a girly type bottled drink. We drank for a bit, and then hit the dance floor. So I had been taught about safety while out at the club. I knew all the things to watch out for. A tip that a co-worker had once given to me was to put your thumb partially in the neck of your bottled drink if you're not going to be paying close attention to it, as it disables access for anyone who might want to put something in there. So that is exactly what I did the entire night. A few guys had asked us girls to dance, and we obliged. Eventually, the second guy I ended up dancing with gave me a weird vibe. He tried to buy me a drink, saying he would go to the bar and get it for me. I declined. He asked if he could hold my drink for me while we danced, seeing as how I had a wristlet in my other hand, and he just wanted to be helpful. I declined and he got pushy. I got the weird vibe after those couple of different passes, and when the songs changed I left him, saying I needed to find my friends. My friends and I hung out for a while, then went back out onto the dance floor. Lo and behold, who would slide up next to me? So here I am, a 21-year-old with no clubbing experience and no huge dating experience, feeling uncomfortable while this guy dances with me. I don't assert myself. I was intimidated and feeling a little rubbish. I let him dance near me, kind of vaguely dancing but avoided eye contact, keeping an eye on my friends, both of whom were dancing nearby. And that's when he got all touchy-feely. He put one of his hands on my waist, not aggressively, but it made me even more uncomfortable. Took my free hand as the wristlet was hanging on my wrist, and made a few "woohoo, look at us, we're dancing" kind of motions. Then he switched his hand, ran down my other arm, lightly grasped my hand, the one where I was holding my drink, and I feel his finger slide until he's touching my bottle. My stomach turned over, but I kept dancing, not really knowing what to do. And that's how it went, every so often. He would feel around my hand and bottle, my thumb firmly lodged in there, and then let go. After about a minute of this, I felt his forefinger and thumb grasp my bottle thumb as if to confirm, to test, to see if it was indeed in there. At that moment, the song changed, and I saw my friend in my peripheral vision. I made direct eye contact with him, and we shared a moment that really made me feel like he was thinking, "I know you just got what I was trying to do." And I fled in the direction of my friend, and we found my other friend and went to another club. I can't think of another reason why he would want to have his hand near my own hands or my drink. I know what he wanted to do, and so do you. I wonder how many other girls he had tried that with that night. I certainly hope he never succeeded. What a creep. My daughter and younger sister and I are 9 hours away from home, visiting my dad for late Christmas. I was sitting in the family room with my sister and stepmom Angie. She was on a ladder that goes into the attic helping my dad run some speaker wire. My daughter was around the corner playing in the closet. Things are quiet as my stepmom needed to be able to hear my dad give her instructions. All of a sudden, we hear my daughter giggle from the closet and yell, "Betty! Betty, what are you doing?" My stepmom comes off the ladder and half sprints towards me. Does Haven know anyone named Betty? She doesn't to my knowledge, and has never heard the name. I got up off the couch and walked over to where my daughter was playing. I crouched down and asked, "Who's Betty?" She's Betty. Grandma Betty. She's talking to Angie." We all freeze. No way. Betty is my stepmom's late mother, who passed away 5 years ago in December, and possibly the sweetest woman I've ever met. My daughter goes back to playing alone in the closet with Betty. We're all stunned. I think it's really cool, and it was kind of an emotional moment. I've always believed in the paranormal, and it makes me happy that it's being opened to my daughter. Has anyone else had their children seemingly converse with those who have passed? I was cleaning up my workroom, which is kind of a shed outside with no windows and a workbench. I had placed my guitar leaning up against a wall while I cleaned and stumbled upon a Ouija board I had made. I'm not into it or anything, I don't believe in ghosts, it was just something I did for my friends, and because none of us had ever done it, we were curious. That's another story though, but I digress. I was standing with the Ouija board just kind of zoning out on it, when the guitar just went bong, like someone had hit the string or the guitar itself. It made the loudest noise. It was so loud that I screamed and jumped nearly out my pants with fear. I looked all around the room for close to an hour for anything that could have fallen on it, bumped it, or otherwise knocked the guitar, and nothing was out of place. I left everything as it was, and showed my girlfriend, friends, and anyone I could to get to check it out, because I was going crazy over it. I still can't explain it. Even if something fell on the guitar, it had to have been something heavy and or metal based, because of the sheer volume of noise that came out of this thing. I had this 19-year-old kid with fetal alcohol syndrome, living in my condo complex with his family. The parents were drunks, and he had no friends. So one day while I was on my balcony, we got to chatting, and I invited him over to play some video games. It all went well, and I told him he could hang out again with me sometime. Well, he took that to mean every waking hour. For the next few weeks he would call incessantly, and wait until I got home and just ring on my doorbell non-stop, to the point that I couldn't go an hour with him bugging me. Even when it was 1 a.m. on a weekday, he would sometimes ring the doorbell. Despite all the talks I had with him telling him to chill and to not contact me constantly, he just wouldn't stop. Over the next month or so, it actually got worse until it reached a breaking point, and I said enough is enough, and that he was no longer welcome. The last incident was where the creepiness kicked into high gear. There was another 1 a.m. door knock, and like all the previous times before, I just ignored it, made sure my doors were locked and the lights remained off. When I got up in the morning to leave work, I saw a mostly empty bottle of whiskey and a large knife just laying on my front door. I have no idea what he had planned, or if it was even him who left those things, but I'm pretty glad I didn't open the door and give him an earful about respecting people's personal space. My mum's friend, who was a teacher, was threatened by a 7-year-old. We live in a country where gangs are a big problem, and the teacher worked in a public school in a dangerous zone. The teacher noticed there was something wrong with this girl. She wasn't as active as her classmates, so the teacher tried to reach her. After noticing the teacher's concern, the girl said something like, "What do you want? I've noticed you've been good to me, so what do you want from me? I know nothing is free in this life." After that, the girl told the teacher her parents were important gang members, some of her problems, and that she should piss off before she told her dad about the teacher's concern. My father and I used to live in this Victorian-style house in northern central Wisconsin some years back. I lived in that house from ages 6 to 12, and have seen and heard some unexplainable stuff. I also wasn't the only one to see that. My father told me it was almost a daily thing for him at one point when I grew up. It was our first Thanksgiving dinner in the house. I was 7 at the time. My parents are divorced, but my father invited my mother to Thanksgiving dinner so that she wouldn't be alone. My grandmother also drove down from Upper Michigan to celebrate the holiday with us. We are just setting up the dinner table. My grandmother was on one side of the table and my mother was on the other. I was walking into the room when a coaster just gently glided across the dining room. Everyone stops, looks at me and asked if I threw the coaster like a frisbee. I was shocked and responded no. How can I throw it when my hands are full? At the time, I was carrying in the mashed potatoes. Everyone very slowly looks down, and I could see the shock and confused, scared look on their faces. They questioned me about it throughout the night. It freaked me out. The next event was when I was home alone one summer vacation when my father was gone at work. I was 9 years old at the time, sleeping in from a long night of TV. I woke up to the TV getting louder and louder. I could also hear people having a conversation in the living room, which is where the TV was. I walked downstairs calling for my dad and received no reply. And as I got down to about halfway down the stairs, the TV shut off. So I creep around and find no one home at all. I ran back upstairs and stayed in my bed until my dad came home from lunch. Another unexplained event happened a few weeks later. Father and I went out to go do some grocery shopping, and we were gone for a few hours or so. When we came back, we found all of the clocks in the house were all dead and stopped at different times. I honestly don't even know what happened. Then there's one more experience, when I was 11. I was downstairs in the basement home alone doing laundry and heard the back door open and close hard. Naturally, I thought my dad was home, and I walk up the basement stairs and hear a woman with heels walking on the hardwood floor. I also see a shadow cast under the door. As I got to the top, I opened the door to find no one in the house. This happened last year, while I was living with my boyfriend at the time, in an old 2-story house. The front door was downstairs and could be opened with a strong force even when locked. We then had initial stairs that led to basically another front door that locked a lot better. Still the most unsafe I felt in a house, even after I left this guy, Nigel, and moved into my own place in a shifty area of town. I couldn't break into that unit, but I certainly broke into the 2-story house a few times. I know, I should have just remembered my keys. So, it's a Sunday night. Nigel and I are watching TV in the lounge room, and there's a knock at the front door. I'm not really an unannounced visitor kind of gal, but Nigel had a few friends that would surprise visit after a binge. I looked at Nigel, and he shrugged, then sent me down to check it out in case it was one of those friends, so I could say he was asleep and send them on their way. I open the door, and there's no one. I call out a few times and don't get an answer, so I shut the door. I hear someone muttering and another knock, and something along the lines of, "I'm not gonna bite." This comment really annoyed me because it's night, and this is my damn place, and I don't like to be viewed as fearful. I open the door for round 2 and see a guy much taller than me, as I'm only 160 centimeters, so it's not that hard. A little wiry, but not too thin, and fairly decently dressed. He looked kind of perturbed that I had opened the door and proceeded to ask for the owner by name. I let him know, "Sorry mate, they're not here. We're renting off them," assuming that that would be the end of that, and glancing ever so slightly at the stairs, waiting for Nigel to come down and help me. This guy won't stop shifting from foot to foot, can't help but ensure he's moving at all times, and proceeds to argue a bit with me to produce Harry and Linda, the couple that owned the house I was renting. At this point, I started getting the impression he's not sober. I start to conclude the conversation and send old mate on his way, when he asks me if my partner's there. This instantly put my guard up. I replied with a positive, and he asked me to get him, let me know he's already met him, and that he needs to talk to him. I cocked an eyebrow and asked him how he knew my partner, especially considering he hadn't called him Nigel at all, but just referred to him as my partner. But I'm kind of glad I did, because he mentioned my housewarming. Nigel had told me that the night of our housewarming, after I had passed our upstairs, he was cleaning and some strange guy had let himself in and sat down at our back table without a word. Nigel asked who he was, and this guy decided to aggressively ask right back, stating he was a friend of Harry's. Nigel was pretty charming when he needed to be, and got him out without too much of a hassle, and relayed the story to me as more of a joke, so I never worried about it too much. But now, I was worried. This is when the tirade about Nigel's car started. He kept repeating, "I need to talk to your partner. I've seen him driving around town with my ex-missus and my kids." He even pointed to my boyfriend's car in the driveway. This rattled me for half a second, because Nigel's car was only one of the 3 of its model in our town. But the general demeanor of this guy, I had basically concluded he was high, and set me back on track. I told him it was time to leave, or I would call the police, and shut the door on his face. I raced upstairs with my phone out, dialed the number, and watched through the window to make sure he left. Nigel half-heartedly asked what was happening, claiming he couldn't hear anything. We could hear the neighbours half the time from our lounge room though, so this little sod didn't actually give two craps about my safety versus his laziness. I explained and then called our landlord. She knew exactly who he was and explained that he had been swallowed up by the wonderful world of meth and reportedly has been knocking on doors of the whole suburb asking if people knew where his ex and child were. Thankfully, I never saw him again, and I really hope he got some help. And to the people in the house now, I hope you don't have to meet him. For almost a year now, my daughter of 4 has been seeing unsettling things. It started out normal enough, I guess, her telling me she sees her friends in her toy room. I didn't think too much about it at first. Not too long after that, she tells me she doesn't like her friends anymore, and I asked her why. She tells me her friends don't have eyes. Pretty creeped out at this point, but sort of hoping it was something she just overheard somewhere or something. After this, she refused to be alone, even if her mother or myself were in the same room, but too far away. We had to basically be in arm's length at all times or she would freak out. If she woke up from a nap, she would just scream until we ran in there and got her, and she would cling on to us. More and more things started to happen. Things falling off her shelves, doors opening on their own, hearing footsteps in our attic. We ended up moving and things settled down, until recently. It started with her seeing shadows in our room. She's having very creepy and unexplainable nightmares. Doors are opening on their own again, and today she told me something that gave me goosebumps. I was helping her to use the bathroom, and she tells me that one time her mother had to go get toilet paper while she waited in the bathroom. But she wasn't alone because Lola was there. Right after telling me, she put her head down and stopped talking, almost like it slipped out. I asked her who Lola was and she didn't reply. I asked her again and she says, no. I tell her it's okay and that she can tell me. All she would say is that Lola scares her. I try to pry any information out, but she just shuts down or tries to change the subject. I'm at a loss here. I'm very worried. This story is from the friend of my mum and her husband. They had just had their first baby and had bought an old house in the middle of nowhere in southwest Sweden. The husband worked at sea and was gone weeks at a time, leaving his wife and their newborn at home. It wasn't long after they moved in while he was away at sea that she started to feel uncomfortable in the house, like just a feeling that something was off. She started to get this sensation more and more, but like me, being a skeptic, she brushed it off as a feeling of loneliness since her husband was away. But then it evolved to more than just a feeling. That night, she thought she could hear footsteps on the stairs leading up to the second floor, where she and the baby were asleep. She continued to try and convince herself that this also was something she imagined, half awake, half asleep, and tried to convince herself that it was an old house with wooden stairs, and that old houses make. But it continued almost every night, and she started to get a bit freaked out as soon as day turned to night. She would also notice the baby would focus on certain points in the ceiling and suddenly stop or start crying. More than newborns usually do, and more frequent flipping from crying to total silence, and a look of deep concentration while staring straight up, as if there was something there to focus on. The mother continued to try and explain the noises with rational thinking, and this being her first child, she tried to convince herself that it was normal behavior for a newborn. Only a few weeks old anyway. Then one day in the middle of the day, when the kid was upstairs in the crib sleeping and her downstairs in the kitchen, did she hear footsteps on the stairs. Only this time they were really loud, and then a thud, as if someone had slammed the door. She just froze up until she heard her baby crying bloody murder. She ran up the stairs to not only find the door to the bedroom closed, something she never did so that she could hear the baby, but the baby was on the floor screaming. Remember, this baby is only a few weeks old. There's no way he could even sit up by himself, let alone climb out of a crib and crawl to the center of the room. After that, they sold the house and moved away. I've heard this story from the lady herself, and she's an honest and very good friend. I trust her very much, and after hearing this, I try to keep an open mind about the paranormal in the world. One night, our daughter came into our room and started banging on the door. I rush out, open the door, and ask her what's wrong. She's in tears and says that the woman in her room won't go away. I quickly grab the baseball bat from behind the door and sneak into the room, ready to batter whoever the hell this is. As I open the door, I search the room and no one's there. I scream for my daughter and ask her where she last saw the lady, and she says under the bed. Sure enough, I peek, and there's no one. My daughter starts screaming upon entering her room, and is insisting that she's under her bed. My daughter starts freaking out, and tells me to hit her with the bat. I give a few hits to under the bed, but my daughter continues screaming, and says that she's angry and that she's behind me. At this point, I get all my family out, jump into the car, and go to my parents' house for the night. We come back the next morning, and my daughter says that the woman is gone. But then the same thing happens a week later. Safe to say, we decided to sell our house shortly after. No way I could live there after that. When I was around 10 or 11, I lived in this small town in Missouri. Well, I always thought my house was haunted, but I could never get proof to show my mum. One night I was laying in my room with my door closed, and I just couldn't go to sleep. Keep in mind that my room is on the other side of the house, but my front door is very loud. To picture this moment better, you have to have an understanding of my old home. When you walk in the house from the front door, there is an open living room, dining room and kitchen. Then you go down this long hallway and there are rooms and bathrooms, and the bedroom is on the right, and across from that is my older brother Zach's room, who was at college at this time. Then on the same side of Zach's room is my mother's room. Then right across from hers is my room, then a closet at the end of the hallway. Well, I was laying in bed and Zach had come home from work, and he was already asleep as I could hear him snoring. And all of a sudden, I hear slow footsteps coming down the hallways. It sounded like they started at the front of the hallway, and they sound like big boots. While I'm freaking out, I could hear it come right in front of my door. Then I heard my mum cough and then turn over. Right as she did, the footsteps stopped and turned back around, and slowly walked down the hallway and disappeared at the front of the hallway. Whoever it was never opened a door or window, because my house is pretty old. Another time, a few months after the incident, my mum was actually watching TV in the living room, and I was about to fall asleep, when all of a sudden I heard, "Get out," right by my ear. I could even feel the hotness on my ear, and it sounded like a little girl. Then, I just kept my eyes closed for 30 seconds and yelled for my mother. Another time something like that happened was when I was in my mum's room laying down, and all of a sudden I hear a man's voice in the same room as me. My father didn't live with me at the time, and Zach was at work. I couldn't make out what he said, but it obviously freaked me out. I live about 3 hours away from there now, and nothing has happened. I hope nothing more does occur. I worked on a mine in Australia, on the west coast, back in 2009. The Mine Emergency Response Term, ERT, was called to an incident being some fishermen washed off a popular fishing rock nearby called Garth's Rock. Luckily, we had a ship in port, and as such, had 3 tugboats in the vicinity, and they were able to respond to the people in the water before our arrival at the port, which is about a 20-minute drive from the main site. We arrived and needed to reverse the ambulance about 150 meters down the jetty, as it was only 1 lane, and to leave without having to back up was a bit of a priority. Myself, as the officer in charge, and 3 other medics grabbed our first response gear and some extra thermal blankets, then made our way down to a lower boat landing and were given flotation devices before we were allowed to board the tug, and after doing so, we were ushered to the port side gallery door, where inside 3 casualties were resting after being pulled from the ocean after about 2 hours of floating around. Due to the tight confines of the galley, the 2 tug workers that were inside doing their best to look after them had to leave to accommodate my team, and they both left out the starboard gallery door and remained outside, as did 3 to 4 other tug workers on the port side, with a few others on other parts of the boat. When we entered, it took a while to adjust to the light. There were 2 tables on my right up against the wall that has a bench seat on either side that you have to slide into with a table in the middle, which is all bolted in place. In front of these 2 booths was a small gap that you could use to walk the length of the room, and either enter one of the seats or leave by the port or starboard doors. I assessed that there were 3 people in the room. 2 of them were on the ground, one immediately in front of me laying on his side, and the other on his back halfway down the gap, where you walk, and both were middle-aged men, with many obvious cuts and scrapes from attempting to climb rocks back up the reef and get to land unsuccessfully. The 3rd casualty, however, was an older man who was sitting at the far gallery table with his hands clasped in front of him, elbows on the table and a 1,000-yard stare, even though looking at him he had as many clear injuries such as cuts and so forth, with most obviously needing further care, such as stitches, and a lot of blood had oozed out and congealed over the table, with his hands just clasped together with his elbows on the table. I directed the other medics, as appropriate, during my triage, being one to each of the prone casualties, and myself and another medic attended to old mate just sitting there. We were made aware by one of the other medics dealing with one of the other guys on the floor that this was his dad, and he was earlier very, very upset that he had entered the water after his mate was washed in, and apparently he kept on going on and repeated the same thing over and over, about having to bloody save his son, and only went quiet a few minutes before our arrival. After several attempts, the old mate showed no understanding or interest in communication with myself or my partner, so between us we just decided that shock and/or hypothermia were probably a factor, and attempted to first put a thermal blanket on him, while at the same time I would try to take some primary vitals and see if there was any obvious life-threatening bleeding above or under the table. Then it went pear-shaped. This guy looked my other medic in the eyes and said, "You can't resolve this. You are just occupying my presence. You need to let me keep going." I looked at my partner the same way we have many times before we have come across a hysterical or incoherent casualty. But this bloke was so calm and unwavering, with interlaced fingers and a deadpan voice, that we just stared at each other, waiting for the other to take charge, which is quite common in these circumstances. After a few seconds, I found composure and informed him that he had encountered a spot of mischief and we needed to assess and fix his wounds, and that soon we would be at the hospital and all would be progressing from there, and that he could relax. Well, the old mate, quick as a wicket, stood upright, and the table broke free of its base and hit me pretty hard on the right leg. Now, I don't mean the table was rotten or crappy, it was just poorly fastened to the floor. I mean, the tabletop made an audible splinter from where I saw him standing up, with the force concentrated on his two front thighs, and actually broke it loose, pushing it into me and against the back of the seat. My medic mate, being so crammed in a tight area of the gallery, later told me that he put out his left hand to the casualty and his right hand to the tabletop to grab it and stabilize it. The old mate was very quick and pushed past my mate medic and went out the starboard galley door like the wind. I pushed the table forward on the bench top, and both myself and mate medic followed, probably only your second or two behind. But a search of the deck and a run up the stairs proved nothing in finding him, and no one outside the gallery saw anything except myself and my partner. There are stairs that led to the wheelhouse, and up there were 6 or 7 higher-ups from the mining company, and none of them saw anyone but us climbing the stairs in a frantic fit, looking for him. Upon returning to the gallery, the guy who handed us inflation devices before boarding was still manning the dock, and he said no one had passed him. The captain of the tug was behind the controls the whole time, because he was required to keep the nose of the tug against the dock, and 3 other deckhands were all outside the doors, port and starboard, all of which provided a 360-degree view of the lower deck, and all said they did not see anyone leave after we medics entered the gallery. We returned to the gallery, and despite being weirded out, the other 2 casualties were treated and transferred off-site to the hospital. In the debrief, it was only myself, my partner, and one of the other 2 medics that verified that the older guy was in the room, as the other medic involved had no recollection, but thinks she just was too involved in her own case, and the tugboat crew reported stating 2 people pulled from the water, and that there was no 3rd casualty. I tried to talk to the casualties in the hospital afterwards to try and get some answers, and find out if they saw him, or if indeed the old mate was one of their fathers, but after 2 consecutive days, my shifts ended, and I had the day before beginning night shift to go to the hospital, and they'd both been discharged. My brother-in-law works at the hospital, and he says that nothing was untowards about them, except that one of the guy was all, "I'm so happy to be alive," while the other guy didn't do much else than sit silently, looking out the window and not eating anything. To this day I still have no idea what the hell happened, but, as is usual, only myself and mate medic speak about it occasionally when we're drunk, and that's all we can do. I am increasingly thinking there is something up with my daughter. She claims right now she's been hearing weird voices for the last few weeks. She can't understand what they're saying, but asked if I'm hearing them too. I asked her straight up, and she says she's not sure if they're real or in her head, but they don't scare her, and she thinks they're saying nice things. She asked me this morning on the way to school, which is what prompted me to write this. So, what I've seen have been 5 or 6 taps left running in different rooms in the house that I don't remember turning on, and that I don't remember being on when I left the room. Last one was this morning, when I got out the shower and found it going. I thought I was finally losing my senses. My keys, wallet and ID and other stuff have been showing up all over the place. I always put it down in the same place, a drawer near the door when I come in. I found them literally all over the house. I don't think anyone is playing a trick on me, because I've even had them out searching to help me look a few times, and they complained about it. I found a block of cheese in the knife drawer. I thought I was just distracted and stupid and put it there, but I've started finding pantry things in the fridge, and fridge things in the pantry. Nothing quite as weird as the cheese, but a few things that went bad. I questioned the family at the time, and everyone denied it and was annoyed, because I accused them. Lots of doors will randomly open and close when I remember them the other way. A lot of lights are on or off when I remember leaving them the other way as well. And when I'm home alone, it's really weird. I'm starting to question my sanity a bit. This past summer of 2018, I would sneak out at night. An hour after I would sneak back into my bedroom, a light would shine through my window, almost like it was scanning my window. It was not a car passing by. It seemed like a flashlight shining in. The background of the light was pitch black outside. It usually isn't that dark. I look out after the light has passed, and I wouldn't see anything in front of my actual window. There is a glass storm window to protect my actual window from storms. On a particular night, it wasn't like the other nights when the light would shine. The light shined through my window, and then all of a sudden I heard something rattling my storm window as if it was trying to break in. I look out and see nothing. After I stopped sneaking out in the summer, the light would stop. A few days ago I did not sneak out at night, and I saw a light shining through my window scanning them. Has anyone else experienced anything remotely similar to this? So to put this into context, I had just finished my competitive exams to enter an engineering school, meaning that I just came out of high school preparatory classes, aka 2 years of hell in the French system. I needed to get out before getting my final results, so as the naive, gullible, and honestly sort of dumb 18-year-old I was, I decided I wanted to go to Berlin and stay in a hostel for a week by myself. My parents allowed me to go, although I can be dumb, I'm trustworthy, and usually well aware of risks. So I went. When I got there, I sat outside next to my hostel, because the room wouldn't be available for 3 more hours. A 30-something-year-old dude came up and sat next to me. I asked for a cigarette, and that started a conversation. How great. He seemed pretty nice, liked filmmaking, and we shared the same political views, and the discussion is lively and entertaining. That's a nice dude right there. Plus, he offered to get us a beer at the nearest supermarket, so I'm pretty cool with the first person I met. Sure, right. He suggests we go out and get a drink later with the Airbnb guest he has over, but first to go to his place for a bit. This is where I get really stupid. I was a little iffy, but he seemed nice enough, and for some reason I didn't even give it a second thought. He could be lying about the other person being there, so I agreed, and he came to my hostel to pick me up. He literally lived 100 meters away. How convenient. When I met him, although he spoke perfect English earlier, he was now not really making any sense, probably mixing German and English. He had no real point in his sentences, and he took forever to reply to whatever I was saying. First red flag, you say? But I tried reassuring myself, thinking that perhaps he'd just had a bit too much to drink. When we get up to his apartment, I find an Airbnb guest, a 40-something-year-old American who kind of looked petrified. I immediately understood why, considering the apartment was an absolute dump. We went to sit in the kitchen, but I refused to drink anything, finally gaining some common sense, and asked the guy several times why he was being so weird, and he told me that he had taken some coke. Now I go into full-blown panic mode. I had never taken anything besides the occasional joint, so to me, that was 8 out of 10 on the messed up scale. I realized he had me trapped against the wall and was blocking the only exit. At this point, I'm already envisioning many ways to leave this place if things get messy. And at some point the guy got up to do whatever, and the Airbnb guy told me the rooms look nothing like they did on the website, and he hadn't signed up for this. We were whispering to each other that we needed to get the hell out of there, and that he needed to find a hotel to stay in, like we were in a movie or something. When the guy came back, I told him I was pretty uncomfortable staying there, and for approximately 10 minutes he refused we leave, telling me that I could not, until I just got up, went to the front door, and he held me back for another 5 minutes, because I was nice and didn't want to storm off and trigger anything. The dude finally let me go, and I ran for it. I didn't go out for 2 days, not even to get anything to eat. I just watched TV shows and stayed in bed. So, creepy Berlin guy, you definitely killed the naive part of me, so thank you for that. But, please, let's never meet again. This happened to me last summer, when I was back at my parents' house during the holidays. It was around 3 a.m, and I was in my room on my computer when I got a call from my sister. Now, that was already a little bit weird, since my sister's room is just down the hallway from mine, and she could have just come into my room. I went to pick it up, and the call ended as soon as I reached for the phone. I figured that she just wanted to speak with me, so I got up and went to her room. As soon as I reached the door, she started screaming that someone was in the room with her, so I busted in, and no one was there. After she stopped crying, she told me that she woke up and saw a dark shadow just centimeters from her face, and that's when she screamed. So I told her that she called me, and she said that her phone isn't in her room, and that she was sleeping. Sure enough, her phone was actually downstairs in her purse. The weirdest part is that I have the log of her call on my phone, but she does not. We've never been able to explain that one away. My daughter continues to do very spooky things. I'm sure there are rational explanations, and usually I figure out what they are, but this one stumped me. The other night, she proceeded to read my mind over and over. I picked her up from school, and we were walking by this vending machine where I often buy her a chocolate milk, but I didn't have any coins with me. When I looked at it, I thought that in my head, damn, I forgot my change. But she answered out loud, "That's okay." And when I said, "What?" she said, "It's okay you forgot to bring money. I'm not thirsty anyway." I figured it was just her head reading my body language or something. Maybe that time it was. In the car, she asked me about having a friend over, and before I could answer, she said, "Okay, another night when we're not so busy then." I think she answered as I was thinking, and not even said yet, "We've got a busy night with..." And I was just listing the things in my head as she interrupted me. When dinner was ready, she came downstairs the second it was ready without me needing to call her. We watched a movie, and I was getting hungry, and as I was thinking of a snack, she went and got me exactly what I was thinking of. It's not something I have often either, and she just guessed it. That's all I can remember, but there is more. I spent the entire night sure she could read my thoughts. But the next morning, everything returned to normal. This was when I was working as a nurse at an Ebola clinic in Liberia. Most of the patients that had Ebola and died didn't hemorrhage much, a little vomiting and diarrhea, but nothing of hot zone level, except for one guy. It was myself, a Liberian sprayer, and a Liberian nurse. We suited up to take a man out the back of the Liberian ambulance, a pickup truck with a covered bed and a washable mattress. This guy was in his early 20s and was in poor condition. He crawled onto a stretcher we laid down for him. He was sweating profusely and his eyes were already blood red. The blood red of a man ready to die from Ebola. He didn't speak any English, just smattering off Capellian moans. He rolled on his side and vomited. A slow, gelatinous mass rolled out of his mouth, as dark as 1,000 moonless African nights. It left his body thick as an apple. It rolled out of his body and splattered against the canvas of the stretcher, covering my Tyvek suit from the knees down in dark blood. For those 2 seconds it was leaving his body, before it splattered on the stretcher, it was alive. It was Ebola incarnate. We washed the man off with 0.05% bleach solution and took him inside. We did an Ebola test, PCR, and pushed a liter of fluid and 1 liter of oral rehydration salts. This perked him right up. He sat up, asked for food, and ate a generous portion of fufu. We thought we had managed to turn things around and that he might make it, but he was dead in 2 hours. I still can't look at Jello today without thinking of him. When I was very young, my grandmother had a painting that hung in the living room of her old house. This painting was of 2 women playing the piano, one playing while the other listened and pointed at the music, as if in the act of teaching the song. I would often sleep over at her house as a child. I have countless distinct memories of seeing the figures in the painting move at night, not in an intelligent way, but in a sort of acting out the scene sort of way, almost like how a GIF is on the internet nowadays. Constant, looped actions. The woman playing the piano would begin to actually strike the keys and tap her foot to the rhythm, while the other woman would nod her head in approval or disapproval as she judged the performance. There was no sound. I was so young and saw the painting do this so often that I thought nothing of it,